Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Picture a clay tablet pressed with wedge-shaped marks, nearly 4,000 years ago. On it, a woman writes to her distant husband, not of war or conquest, but of household repairs, her children's health, the textiles she is weaving to sell. She complains about silver, she worries about barley prices. She asks when he will come home from his business trip, a journey of 6 weeks each way by donkey caravan. This is Assyria, before it became an empire. Before the great armies, before the winged bulls guarding palace gates, before the kings who called themselves rulers of the four corners of the earth, there were merchants, traders who carried tin and textiles across mountains and rivers, who kept meticulous records on clay, who built networks of trust and credit that stretched from the banks of the Tigris to the highlands of Anatolia. They left us thousands of letters, contracts, receipts, the most intimate archive of ancient voices we possess from anywhere in the Near East. How does a society of careful accountants and long-distance traders transform into history's first true military empire? How do merchant families, who worry about interest rates and textile quality, become the people remembered for iron weapons and conquered cities? Tonight, we trace that transformation. We walk with caravans through mountain passes. We sit in merchant houses, where cuneiform tablets pile in sealed rooms. We witness the slow emergence of a civilization that would, in time, cast a shadow across the entire ancient world. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. The sands of time shift beneath you, carrying you backward to the valley of the Tigris River, to northern Mesopotamia in the second millennium before the Common Era, when the city of Ashur was rising from the dust of the Assyrian plain, the land between the rivers. The Tigris flows south through a landscape of extremes. In spring, snowmelt from the Armenian highlands swells the river, turning its waters brown with silt. In summer, the same river can shrink to a fraction of its flood stage, leaving mud banks exposed under a merciless sun. This was the corridor of ancient Assyria, the heartland that gave birth to a civilization, not the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, where Sumer and Babylon flourished, but a harder country, a place where survival required tenacity. Ashur itself stood on a rocky outcrop on the west bank of the Tigris, about 60 miles south of where the city of Mosul would later rise. The location was no accident. Here, caravan routes converged. To the east, paths led over the Zagros Mountains toward Iran and the distant sources of precious tin. To the west, roads stretched across the dry plains toward Syria and the Mediterranean coast. To the north, trails climbed into the Anatolian highlands, where copper and silver waited in mountain veins. Ashur sat at a crossroads. The climate shaped everything. Winters brought cold rains that turned the plain to mud. Summers arrived with furnace heat that baked the earth hard as pottery. Between these extremes, spring painted the landscape green for a few brief weeks before the grass yellowed and died. This was not a land of easy abundance. So that barley grew here, but not with the profusion it achieved in the southern marshlands. Olives would not thrive. Grapevines struggled. The people of Ashur learned early that wealth would not come from their fields alone. So they looked outward. They built boats to ride the Tigris current, carrying goods downstream to Babylonia. They bred donkeys, sturdy creatures that could carry heavy loads across rocky terrain where wheeled carts could not go. They developed the skills of middlemen, the arts of negotiation and contract, the careful calculation of profit margins and transport costs. Geography made them traders before it made them warriors. The city itself was small at first, perhaps 50 hectares enclosed by walls. But walls matter. In Mesopotamian thought, a city without walls was not truly a city. Ashur's walls defined sacred space, separated civilization from wilderness. Inside those walls, mud brick houses crowded together along narrow lanes. Smoke from cooking fires drifted over flat roofs where families slept on summer nights. The ziggurat of the god Ashur rose in the center, a man-made mountain reaching toward heaven. Here, in this modest city of perhaps 8,000 or 10,000 souls, a distinct identity was forming. The Assyrian plains stretched around the city, broken by low hills and the occasional wadi that ran with water in winter and turned to dust in summer. To walk from Ashur in any direction was to enter a landscape of villages and small settlements, each one growing its barley and herding its sheep, each one looking to Ashur as a market and a source of manufactured goods. This was the immediate world of early Assyria, not yet an empire, not yet even a kingdom of great extent, just a city and its hinterland, positioned at the right place to profit from the movement of goods across the ancient world. But position alone does not make a civilization. The land shaped the Assyrians, made them hard workers and shrewd calculators, made them look beyond their own fields for prosperity. The real story of how Ashur became Assyria begins not with armies, but with caravans, with merchants willing to travel for weeks through foreign lands, with families who maintained relationships across vast distances, with a people who learned to read and write because their business demanded it. The empire would come later, built on foundations of tin and textiles, of copper and credit, of careful records pressed into clay. The merchants of Ashur, in the early centuries of the second millennium BC, around 1900 to 1700 BC, the merchants of Ashur were running one of the most sophisticated trading operations the world had yet seen. They called themselves Tamkarum, a word that meant merchant, trader, someone who made their living by buying and selling. These were not peddlers with packs on their backs. They were businessmen operating at a scale and with a level of organization that would not seem out of place in much later periods of history. Their primary trade route led northwest from Ashur, across the dry plains of the Jazira, over the Euphrates River, and into the Anatolian highlands. There, in central Anatolia, they established trading colonies they called karum, a word related to the Akkadian for quay or harbour. The largest and most important of these was at a place the locals called Kanesh, which the Assyrians called Kanish. Today, we know it as Kultepe, the ash mound, near the modern Turkish city of Kayseri. What did they trade? Two commodities, above all others, formed the backbone of the business. Tin, which came from somewhere far to the east, perhaps from Afghanistan or even farther reaches of Central Asia. And textiles, both locally woven in Ashur and imported from Babylonian cities to the south. These they carried to Anatolia on the backs of donkeys, organized into caravans of 20 or 30 animals, traveling in groups for safety. The Anatolians wanted tin desperately. Mix it with copper, which they had in abundance from their own mountains, and you get bronze. Bronze that is harder than pure copper, bronze that holds an edge, bronze that can be cast into weapons and tools and prestige items. The Assyrians controlled the tin supply, or at least one major route by which it reached the west. This gave them leverage. In exchange, the Assyrians took silver and gold. Anatolia was rich in precious metals. Silver, especially, flowed back to Ashur in quantities that seem almost unbelievable when you read the records. A successful merchant might realize profits of 100% on a single caravan. Over the course of a career, a man could accumulate wealth that would support his extended family for generations. But this was not simple buying and selling. The Assyrian merchants developed sophisticated business practices. They formed partnerships, pooling capital to finance caravans. They extended credit, making loans at interest rates that were carefully specified in written contracts. They used a system of agents and representatives, family members or trusted associates, who would manage the Anatolian end of the business while the senior merchant remained in Ashur. They wrote constantly, sending letters back and forth with every caravan, staying informed about market conditions, prices, the political situation, family matters. They kept detailed accounts. Every transaction was recorded on a clay tablet. How much tin went out? With which caravan? Who was responsible for it? Who guaranteed the debt if something went wrong? When a caravan arrived in Kanesh, tablets were drawn up, documenting the division of goods, the payment of customs duties, the allocation of merchandise to different agents for sale. When silver came back to Ashur, receipts were written. The system ran on paper, or rather, on clay. These merchants were literate. in a world where literacy was rare. They could read and write the cuneiform script, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets. Many of them seem to have written their own correspondence, not relying on scribes. Their sons learned the trade by accompanying caravans and by mastering the accounts. Education meant learning to write, learning to calculate, learning the routes and the languages and the customs of foreign places. The trade made Ashur wealthy. Silver flowed into the city, was invested in land and houses, was lent out at interest to finance more trade. The city hall of Ashur collected taxes on caravans leaving and arriving. The temples received donations from prosperous merchants, grateful for safe journeys. A merchant class emerged with enough wealth to rival the old landed aristocracy, enough influence to shape the politics of the city. They were a conservative people, in some ways, these merchants. They valued family ties, written contracts, the proper observance of religious festivals, but they were also cosmopolitan. They lived for years at a time in foreign cities. They married local women in Anatolia while maintaining wives in Ashur. They learned to navigate multiple legal systems, to speak multiple languages, to adapt to local customs while preserving their own identity as sons of Ashur. This merchant culture, this careful, calculating trading society, formed the foundation of what Assyria would become. The organizational skills, the record-keeping, the networks that stretched across hundreds of miles, the habit of thinking on a large scale and planning for the long term. All of this would later be applied to conquest and administration, but first, it was applied to tin and textiles, to profit and loss, to the patient accumulation of wealth, one caravan at a time. Walking the caravan routes, you are standing at the gate of Ashur as dawn breaks over the Tigris. The air is cool, but you know the day will be hot. Around you, donkeys are being loaded with their burdens. Each animal will carry about 70 kilograms, carefully balanced in panniers slung across its back. The tin is wrapped in leather bags, heavy ingots shaped like rings and rods. The textiles are folded and protected from dust. Everything has been weighed, recorded, accounted for. Your tablet, your contract, is tucked in a sealed clay envelope hanging at your belt. You are travelling with 20 donkeys. There are 4 of you, all told. The kasharum, the harnesser, who manages the animals. A skilled man who can diagnose a lame donkey before serious injury sets in. The saridum, the donkey driver, who knows the route, knows where water can be found, knows which villages are friendly and which require wariness. Another merchant like yourself, a junior partner in this venture, and you, carrying the responsibility for successful sale of the goods in Kanesh. The first day's journey takes you northwest from Ashur. You walk, leading the donkeys, no one rides. The animals are too valuable, too heavily loaded. You walk at their pace, steady and slow, covering perhaps 30 kilometers if the day goes well. The landscape around you is flat, broken by low hills. In the distance, you can see other caravans on other routes, small dark lines moving across the pale earth like ants. You stop at midday in the shade of a rise. The donkeys are unloaded, watered from skins you carry, allowed to rest. You eat bread and onions, dates carried from Ashur. The heat presses down. There is little talk. Energy is precious. By evening, you reach a settlement, one of the stopping points known to all who travel this route. There is a caravanserai here, a courtyard enclosed by walls where travellers can shelter. You pay in tin, a small amount, for the right to stay, for water for the animals, for a space to unroll your sleeping mat. The donkeys are secured. You check each animal for injuries, examine their hooves, apply salve where the panniers have rubbed. A lame donkey means delay, lost profit. The days blur together after the first few. Walk from before dawn until midday. Rest through the worst heat. Walk until evening. Sleep in caravanserais or, when none exist, in the open with guards posted. You cross the Euphrates on ferries, wide, flat boats that can carry several donkeys at once. The animals balk at the water, must be coaxed aboard. The river is wide here, the current strong. On the far bank, you continue north. The landscape changes as you climb into the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. The air grows cooler, Pine trees appear on the higher slopes. The trail becomes steeper, rockier. This is where donkeys prove their worth. They are sure-footed creatures, able to pick their way across terrain where wheeled vehicles could never go. You pass through villages where other languages are spoken, where the people are not Assyrian. Here, you rely on the guide, on your knowledge of basic phrases in local tongues, on the universal language of trade. Silver is understood everywhere. A certain amount of tin is set aside for expenses like these, for payments to local chiefs who control the roads, for bribes when necessary. After 6 weeks, you crest a final rise and see the valley where Kanesh lies. The city on its mound rises above the plain. Below it, spreading across the lower town, is the Karam, the trading colony where Assyrians live and work. Smoke rises from hundreds of cooking fires. You smell civilization, the smell of many people living close together, bread baking, animals penned, the faint sourness of the drainage ditches. You lead your caravan down into the Karam. Merchants emerge from houses to see who has arrived, what news you bring from Ashur, what goods you carry. Greetings are called out. Someone recognizes you. Your family name, asks after relatives. The donkeys are led to a courtyard behind one of the houses, your brother's house, if you are lucky enough to have family here, or the house of your business agent. The tin is unloaded, counted, verified against the records you carry. The textiles are inspected for damage from the journey. Everything matches the tablets, as it should. You are tired, deeply tired, but also satisfied. You have crossed 400 miles of sometimes hostile country. The goods are safe. Now the real work begins. The work of selling, of making profit, of justifying the months away from home. But tonight, you will rest. You will bathe, washing off the dust of 6 weeks' travel. You will eat food prepared by others, drink beer that has not been carried on donkey back. You will sleep under a roof. Tomorrow, you will become a merchant again. Tonight, you are simply grateful to have arrived. Houses of clay and cuneiform. In 1925, a farmer, ploughing his field near the village of Kultepe in central Turkey, struck something hard. He had unearthed a clay tablet covered with strange markings. Word reached scholars, and soon excavations began on the mound that rose above the plain. What they found there changed our understanding of the ancient world. Kultepe was ancient Kanesh, and below the mound, spreading across the lower slopes, was the Karam, the merchant colony where Assyrians had lived for 200 years in the early 2nd millennium BC. The excavators found houses, mud brick structures that had burned in ancient times, preserving their contents like a snapshot of daily life. And in room after room, they found tablets. Thousands of tablets. Archives of clay. By now, over 22,000 tablets have been recovered from Kanesh, making it one of the richest sources of cuneiform texts from any single ancient site. These are not royal inscriptions or mythological texts or temple records. They are private archives, the business papers and personal letters of merchant families. They are, in many ways, the most human documents that survive from the Bronze Age Near East. The tablets are small, most of them fitting comfortably in your hand. They were pressed from clay, probably clay taken from the banks of a nearby stream, kneaded until smooth, formed into rough rectangles. While the clay was still soft, the writer took a reed stylus, cut to a triangular point, and pressed the marks of cuneiform script into the surface. Wedge shape after wedge shape, building up lines of text from left to right, each line below the previous. When the text was complete, the tablet was left to dry in the sun, becoming hard as pottery. For important documents, for contracts and legal records, the tablet would be wrapped in a thin shell of clay like an envelope. The same text was often written on this envelope, and then the envelope was sealed with cylinder seals rolled across the soft surface, creating impressions that served as signatures and guarantees of authenticity. The sealed tablet could then be archived. To read it, you had to break the envelope, destroying the seal impressions in the process. This prevented tampering. If a dispute arose, the envelope could be broken in the presence of witnesses, the inner tablet read, and the truth established. The archives found at Kanesh belonged to families. One room in a house would be designated as the office. The archive room. Clay tablets were stored on shelves, stacked in wooden boxes, or placed in large clay jars. Labels were sometimes attached, brief notations indicating the contents. This box contains loan contracts from the year such and such. This jar holds letters from father to son, covering 3 years of correspondence. The content of these tablets is astonishingly varied. There are letters between husbands and wives separated by 6 weeks' travel. The wife writes from Ashur, complaining that he has not sent enough silver, asking when he will come home, telling him about the children, about repairs needed on the house. The husband writes from Kanesh, explaining that the market is slow, that he cannot send silver until he sells the textiles, telling her to be patient, to wait, promising that when he does come home he will bring her gifts. There are business contracts, laying out the terms of partnerships. 2 men pool their capital to finance a caravan. The terms are explicit. One provides the tin and textiles. The other manages the journey and the sale. Profits will be split 50-50 after expenses are paid. If the caravan is robbed, if the donkeys die, if disaster strikes, the loss will be divided according to the original investment. These contracts show a sophisticated understanding of risk and return. There are loan documents, recording debts with interest rates specified to the month, legal disputes, brought before the assembly of merchants in the Karam, wills, dividing a merchant's estate among his children, purchase contracts for houses, for slaves, for precious objects, marriage contracts, laying out the rights and obligations of husbands and wives, divorce agreements, specifying what each party can take from the marriage, and there are purely personal letters, documents that have no business purpose but simply maintain human connection across vast distance. A sister writes to her brother, worried about his health, urging him to consult a doctor. A son writes to his father, asking advice about a difficult situation. A woman writes to her daughter, news of the neighborhood, gossip about relatives, small concerns of domestic life. The excavation of these archives gives us something precious and rare. We can reconstruct entire family networks. We know the names of merchants, their wives, their children. We can follow business relationships over decades. We can trace the rise of a family to wealth or the slow decline into debt. We can even, in some cases, sense personality. Some letter writers are terse, businesslike. Others are verbose, emotional. Some people come across as careful and conservative, others as risk-takers, gamblers. Most remarkably, we hear women's voices. In most ancient societies, women are nearly invisible in the written record. But in the old Assyrian merchant archives, women write constantly. Merchant wives were often alone in Ashur for years at a time, while their husbands lived in Anatolia. They managed households, oversaw the weaving of textiles for export, handled financial matters, represented family interests. Their letters reveal them as competent, strong-willed, sometimes frustrated by their situations but making the best of them. The houses where these tablets were found have been carefully excavated. We can walk through them in imagination, room by room. The ground floor typically had a kitchen with an oven, storerooms, a reception room for guests, upstairs, the family living quarters, and the archive room. In winter, life centered around the ground floor where the oven provided heat. In summer, the family slept on the roof under the stars. These were not palaces. These were middle-class dwellings, comfortable but not luxurious. The people who lived here were prosperous by the standards of their time, but they worked for their prosperity. They worried about money. They wrote letters calculating profit margins down to fractions of a shekel of silver. They fretted about markets and competition and the risk of robbery on long roads. They were, in short, recognizably human in their concerns and their fears. The tablets sleep now in museums, clay voices from 4,000 years ago, but for a brief moment in the 1920s and in the decades since, as excavators broke through burned levels and found archive after archive intact, those voices spoke again across the millennia. They told us about a world we never knew existed, a merchant culture of sophistication and reach that predated the empire by centuries. They gave us Assyria before Assyria was terrible, when it was merely industrious, when its power came from account books rather than armies. The family enterprise. At the heart of old Assyrian society was the family. Not the nuclear family of parents and young children alone, but the extended family, the web of relationships that stretched across generations and across geography. The family was an economic unit, a business enterprise, a source of identity and obligation. To understand the merchants of Ashur, you must understand how their families worked. A typical merchant family was headed by a patriarch, the father, called Abum in their language. He made the major decisions, whether to invest in a caravan, whether to send a son to Anatolia, or keep him in Ashur, how to divide property among heirs, which daughters to marry off, and which to consecrate to the god Ashur. His authority was considerable, but it was not absolute. He had to consider the opinions of adult sons, had to negotiate with his wife or wives, had to maintain relationships with brothers and cousins whose cooperation might be essential to business success. The eldest son held a special position. He was the heir apparent, the one who would inherit the family house and take on responsibility for the ancestors buried beneath its floor. Often, he was sent to Kanesh to represent the family business there. He would spend years in Anatolia, perhaps decades, managing the sale of goods, extending credit to local buyers, maintaining the family's reputation in the merchant community. Meanwhile, his younger brothers might travel with caravans or stay in Ashur helping the father with the business there. Daughters had value too, though it was expressed differently. A daughter could be married, her marriage alliance bringing the family into closer relationship with another merchant house. The dowry she took with her was a form of property, hers to manage, hers eventually to pass to her children. Or a daughter might be consecrated to the god, becoming a gubabtum, a sacred woman who never married but who remained economically active, investing in trade, lending money at interest, participating in family decisions. Wives occupied a complex position. A merchant might have two wives, one in Ashur and one in Kanesh. This was legal, even normal, as long as they did not have equal status. One would be the Ash-Shatum, the main wife, the other, the Amtum, the second wife. The law was quite specific. A merchant could not have two wives in the same city. This kept the household separate, prevented conflicts. The wife in Ashur typically had the highest status. She was the mother of the legitimate heirs, the keeper of the family home, the one who maintained religious observances. But she was also often alone for years at a time. She had to be capable. She managed servants, supervised textile production, handled money, made decisions about household matters. When letters came from Anatolia, she had to respond, often writing the letters herself, or dictating to a scribe. The wife in Kanesh, if she was Anatolian, brought her husband into relationship with the local society. She gave him ties to Anatolian families, knowledge of local customs, children who could speak both languages. Often, when a merchant finally retired and returned to Ashur permanently, this wife would be divorced. The settlement would be negotiated, her rights and the rights of her children specified in writing. It seems harsh to modern sensibilities, but it was the custom. Children were raised by mothers in early years. Boys would eventually accompany their fathers, learning the business. We have letters from fathers to young sons, teaching them how to evaluate tin, how to judge textile quality, how to spot a cheat in a business deal. Education was practical, hands-on. Girls learned from their mothers, learning to spin and weave, learning household management, learning the complex social skills required of a merchant wife. The family was also the safety net. If a merchant died far from home, his family was responsible for bringing back his goods, for settling his debts, for supporting his widow and orphans. If a merchant fell into debt, his brothers or cousins might help him, lending money to save the family honor. If an elderly parent needed care, the children provided it. The alternative to family support was grim. To be alone, without family, was to be vulnerable in the extreme. Business partnerships often followed family lines. Brothers would pool capital. A father would finance his son's first independent venture. Cousins would agree to represent each other's interests in different cities. Trust mattered enormously in long-distance trade. If you send a caravan off with someone else managing it, you must believe they will be honest about the proceeds. Family ties provided that trust, or at least the expectation of honesty, backed by shame and social pressure. Inheritance was a matter of intense concern. Fathers made wills, specifying how property would be divided. The eldest son typically got a larger share, perhaps a double portion, recognizing his special responsibilities. Daughters received dowries. Sons received trade goods, silver, loan contracts, houses. When a merchant died, his children had to pay off his creditors before dividing what remained. The system worked, most of the time. But the archives also contain bitter disputes. Families torn apart by arguments over inheritance, siblings who stopped speaking over perceived unfairness in a father's will. What comes through in all of this is how hard families worked to maintain themselves across distance and time. Letters flow constantly between Ashur and Kanesh, not just business letters, but letters full of personal news, family gossip, expressions of concern and affection. A wife urges her husband to come home, not because she needs him practically, she seems perfectly capable of managing, but because she misses him. A father writes to his son that he is growing old, that he wants to see his grandchildren before he dies. A sister writes to her brother about their parents' health. The family was the unit that mattered. It was your identity, your safety net, your business network, the audience for your successes, and the support in your failures. Everything else, the state, religion, community, was secondary. The family came first. And that intense focus on family, that web of obligation and affection stretching across the ancient world, that was one of the enduring strengths of Assyrian society. It would outlast the merchant era. It would persist into the age of empire, shaping how Assyrians thought about loyalty and identity for centuries to come. Breathing space. The tablet in your hand. Hold it for a moment in your imagination. The clay is smooth, hard as stone, warm from your hand. It fits your palm perfectly, a small rectangular thing weighing almost nothing. Wedge marks cover both sides, row after row of tiny triangular impressions pressed into the surface when this clay was soft. Someone made this, made it with their hands from river clay, pressed each mark deliberately, one after another, building meaning from marks. It took time, perhaps half an hour to write this letter, choosing words, deciding what to say and what to leave unsaid. Haspas, the writer's hand moved across the clay. Perhaps it was a woman's hand, a merchant wife alone in Ashur, writing to her husband in far Anatolia, perhaps a young man, writing to his father about business matters. Perhaps an old merchant, his hand less steady than it once was, recording his last will, dividing his life's work among his children. When the writing was done, the tablet was set aside to dry in the sun. Then it was stored in a room, on a shelf perhaps, or in a jar with other letters. Years passed, decades. The house burned one day, some disaster now lost to memory. The fire hardened the tablet further, baked it like pottery in a kiln. The roof collapsed, walls fell. The tablet was buried under debris. There it lay for 3,800 years. Empires rose and fell above it. The Assyrian Empire itself grew from this merchant culture, conquered half the known world, then vanished. Centuries of silence. The tells grew higher as generation after generation built on ruins. Farmers ploughed the slopes. Shepherds led their flocks past. No one knew what lay beneath, until shovels found it. Careful excavation brought it back to light. Specialists cleaned it, photographed it, read the ancient script. Now, it rests in a museum, this small clay rectangle that once travelled in someone's hand from house to house, that once was read with relief or disappointment or joy, that once represented connection across vast distance. The voice is still there, still speaking, if anyone takes time to listen. A woman's worry about silver for barley. A man's promise to come home soon. Small concerns of people long dead, preserved by accident and clay and fire, voices waiting in silence, patient, ready to speak again when someone cares to hear them. Marriage, dowries, and distant wives. Enlil-Bani was 25 years old when his father sent him to Kanesh. He had made the journey twice before, travelling with caravans, learning the routes and the business. But this time, he would stay. His older brother, Ashur, managed the family's interests in Ashur. Enlil-bani would represent them in Anatolia. His father had arranged a marriage before he left. The girl's name was Tarisha, daughter of Ashurnasirpal, a merchant family allied with theirs through 2 generations of trade. The wedding took place in Ashur with proper ceremony. The bride price was paid, 10 shekels of silver to Tarisha's father. Her dowry was generous. Textiles, silver jewelry, a slave girl to serve her, household vessels of bronze. All of this was recorded on tablets that would serve as proof of her property rights. The ceremony itself was simple but significant. Enlil-bani and Tarisha stood before witnesses. He declared that he took her as his wife. A veil was placed over her head, the symbol of her married status. They shared beer and bread. The families celebrated with a feast. And then, 3 weeks later, Enlil-bani left for Anatolia with a caravan. His new wife remained in Ashur, living in her father-in-law's house. The first years were difficult for Tarisha. She was young, uncertain of her place in a new household. Her mother-in-law was kind but exacting. There were servants to manage, weaving to oversee, a complex household to learn, and her husband was absent, weeks away, reachable only by letter. She wrote to him often at first, pouring out her loneliness. His replies were tender but practical. Be patient. Work hard. The business requires my presence here. I will come home when I can. 3 years passed. Enlil-bani came back to Ashur twice for brief visits. Tarisha became pregnant during his second visit, bore a son they named Ilidan. The child was a comfort, a focus for her attention. She wrote to her husband with every detail. The baby smiled today. He is healthy, growing strong. Your father dotes on him. When will you come to see your son? But in Kanesh, Enlil-bani's situation had grown complicated. Managing the family business meant maintaining relationships with Anatolian merchants. One of these, a man named Zidanta, had a daughter of marriageable age. Zidanta suggested a match. It would cement their business relationship, give Enlil-bani deeper ties to the local community, and it was legal, permitted under both Assyrian and Anatolian custom, as long as the new wife had lower status. Enlil-bani wrote to his father, seeking approval. The reply came back after 2 months. It is permitted, but you must follow the law. Draw up a contract. She can be an amtum, a second wife, but never equal to Tarisha. Send money for Tarisha. Show her you have not forgotten. Honor both families. The marriage contract was carefully worded. Uwarashatu, daughter of Zidanta, would be Enlil-bani's wife as long as he remained in Anatolia. If he divorced her, he would pay 5 minas of silver. If she divorced him, the same. He promised not to take a third wife. He promised to support her household, to give her food and clothing and wood for fuel. And critically, the contract specified that Tarisha in Ashur remained his Ash-shatum, his main wife. Their children would be his primary heirs. Uwarashatu brought connections Enlil-bani needed. Her family's networks extended into regions where he had struggled to make sales. She spoke Luwian and Hittite, languages he only partly understood. She knew local customs, could negotiate with Anatolian officials in ways he could not. The marriage was practical, but affection grew too. Within a year, she bore him a daughter. Back in Ashur, Tarisha learned of the second marriage through letters from others in the merchant community. Her own husband did not tell her directly, a silence she took as betrayal. She wrote to him in anger, "You have forgotten me. You care nothing for your son. I weave textiles that make you wealthy, and you repay me with an Anatolian woman." His reply was long, apologetic, but also firm. "It is the custom. You knew when I left that this might happen. I have not forgotten you. You are the mother of my heir. When I return to Ashur to stay, I will return to you. But this marriage serves our family's business. You must understand." Understanding came slowly, and acceptance even slower. But Tarisha was practical too. The marriage endured. She continued to manage the household in Ashur, continued to weave, continued to raise her son. Enlil-bani sent silver regularly, gifts for festivals, messages of affection. He also stayed in Kanesh for 15 more years, far longer than he had planned. When he finally did return to Ashur for good, He was 42 years old. His father had died. Ashur, his brother, had taken over the main house. Enlil-bani built a new house nearby, with wealth earned in Anatolia. Tarisha moved into it with him, now a woman of middle age, with a son nearly grown. Their marriage resumed as if the years apart had not happened. In Kanesh, Enlil-bani divorced Uwarashatu with proper settlement. She kept the house they had lived in, a payment of silver, and custody of their daughter until the girl was old enough to marry. The daughter would have rights in her father's estate, though not equal to the rights of Illidan, the son in Ashur. All of this was specified in tablets drawn up before witnesses. It was a common story, this pattern of divided loyalties and distant families. Not every merchant handled it well. Archives contain bitter letters, accusations of abandonment, disputes over money and rights, but many families made it work through a combination of custom, clear contracts, and persistent communication. The system was not built for emotional satisfaction, it was built for business. But within those constraints, room existed for affection, for honour, for the maintenance of human bonds across distance and difference, the sacred and the secular. In the centre of Ashur, on the highest point of the rocky outcrop where the city stood, rose the temple of the god Ashur, not a temple in the sense of a single building, but a sacred complex, a precinct surrounded by walls, containing the ziggurat, the shrine, the courtyards where festivals were celebrated. This was the spiritual heart of the city, the place where divine and human worlds met. The god Ashur had given his name to the city, or perhaps the city had given its name to the god. The relationship was so old that no one could say for certain which came first. What mattered was the bond between them. Ashur the god was the protector and patron of Ashur the city. He demanded loyalty, sacrifice, the proper observance of rituals. In return, he provided prosperity, victory over enemies, continuation of the city's existence. Merchants understood religion in practical terms. They made votive offerings, gifts of silver or gold to the temple. When business went well, they swore oaths in the god's name, making contracts binding through religious sanction. The weapon of Ashur, a sacred object kept in the temple, was invoked in legal proceedings. To swear a false oath on the weapon of Ashur was to invite divine punishment. Women had their own religious observances. They swore oaths on the tambourine of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Ishtar had a temple in Ashur too, though not as grand as Ashur's. She represented the fierce and unpredictable aspects of existence, sexuality, and violence intertwined. Women appealed to her for help in childbirth, for protection of their husbands on dangerous journeys, for fertility and prosperity. But alongside the official religion of temples and priests, Assyrians maintained a network of more personal spiritual practices. Each family had its household gods, small figurines kept in niches in the walls, representing protective spirits. These were addressed in prayers, given offerings of bread and beer, treated as part of the family. When a merchant travelled to Anatolia, he might take a household god with him, a link to home and protection in foreign lands. The dead were also present in daily life. Ancestors were buried under the floors of houses. Their spirits, their etemu, dwelt in some shadowy realm, but remained connected to the living. The eldest son had responsibility for maintaining the cult of the dead, making offerings at appropriate times, ensuring that ancestors were not forgotten or neglected. Failure in this duty could result in haunting, in bad luck, in the anger of spirits who felt abandoned. Women especially seem to have felt the weight of these obligations. Letters speak of women troubled by dreams, visited by angry spirits, worried that they were failing in their duties to the dead. Some of this was practical. If a merchant husband was away in Anatolia for years, who performed the offerings to his parents' spirits? His wife might try, but she was not their blood. The spirits might reject her offerings. Better for the husband to come home, to fulfill his obligations, to set things right. Divination was taken seriously. Before any major decision, a merchant might consult omens. Haruspicy, the examination of sheep's liver, was considered particularly reliable. The diviner would sacrifice a sheep, remove its liver, examine the markings on it. Each lobe, each mark had meaning. A consultation was expensive, but so was failure. Better to spend silver on a diviner than to launch a caravan under inauspicious signs. Some families consecrated daughters to the god Ashur. These girls, called Gubabtum, remained unmarried but lived independently, managing their own property, investing in trade. They were sacred women, under the god's protection, but they functioned economically like male merchants. A family with several daughters might consecrate the eldest, marry off the younger ones. The Gubabtum daughter would then have status and economic power unusual for women, while also bringing religious merit to her family. In Kanesh, Assyrians maintained their religious practices in a foreign land. They established a shrine to Ashur within the merchant quarter, a small sacred space where oaths could be sworn and offerings made. When disputes arose, the parties might go before the weapon of Ashur in Kanesh, just as they would in Ashur itself. The sacred objects, or representations of them, travelled with the merchants, extending the god's reach, but they also learned to respect local gods. Anatolia had its own deities, and it was wise not to offend them. When an Assyrian married an Anatolian woman, her gods became part of the household. Children of mixed marriages grew up knowing prayers in 2 languages, stories about both Ashur and the storm god of the Hatti, both Ishtar and the sun goddess of Arena. Religion, like everything else in the merchant communities, adapted to circumstances. What strikes a modern reader in all of this is how intertwined religion was with daily life, yet how pragmatic the approach. The gods were real, their power was real, but they were also transactional. You gave offerings, you received blessings. You broke oaths, you suffered consequences. Religion was not separate from economics or law or family life. It was woven through everything, a framework of meaning and obligation that made sense of the world and provided structure for navigating uncertainty, daily bread. The day begins before dawn in an Assyrian household. The women rise first, rekindling the fire in the oven that dominates the kitchen. Bread must be made, the flat rounds of barley bread that will feed the family through the day. The women mix flour with water, perhaps adding a bit of old dough to help it rise slightly, kneading it on a flat stone. The dough is formed into rounds, slapped onto the hot interior walls of the oven where it bakes quickly, filling the house with the smell of bread. While the bread bakes, someone goes to fetch water. If the house is near the city wall, near the slope down to the river, this is not too difficult. But water is heavy. It takes strong arms to carry a jar of water up the slope and through narrow streets. In summer, the Tigris runs low and the water is warm, tasting slightly of mud. In winter, it is cold and clear. Either way, water is precious, rationed, used for cooking and drinking but sparingly for washing. The men of the household rise and eat breakfast standing, bread torn from the round, dipped perhaps in oil, or eaten plain. There might be onions, sharp and crisp. There might be dates, dried fruit brought up from the south where palm trees grow. Beer if the household is prosperous, water if not. The beer is thick, nutritious, more like liquid bread than like what later ages would call beer. It is drunk through a straw to avoid the sediment. Then the work of the day begins. For a merchant, this means tablets, checking accounts, writing letters, preparing contracts. He sits in a room set aside for business, tablets stacked around him, a fresh lump of clay at hand. His stylus is a cut reed, shaped to a triangular point. He wets the clay, forms it into a tablet, begins to write. The work requires concentration. Each word must be spelled correctly, each number recorded precisely. A mistake could mean financial loss or legal trouble later. For the women, the work is textiles. Wool must be cleaned, combed, spun into thread. The spindle wool turns, twisting fibres into long, strong threads that will be dyed and woven. The wealthy own their wool, purchase it from shepherds who bring flocks in from the steppe. The less wealthy might take wool on credit, spin and weave it, return the finished product in exchange for a wage. It is piecework, tedious, requiring good light and strong fingers. Weaving happens on upright looms. The warp threads hang vertical, weighted at the bottom with clay loom weights. The weaver passes the weft through, back and forth, building up the fabric row by row. A good weaver can produce a textile of 9 cubits by 8, about 4 meters by 4 meters, in perhaps 2 weeks of steady work. The cloth is examined for flaws. Quality matters. A textile destined for export to Anatolia must meet high standards, or it will not command a good price. Midday is too hot for work in summer. The household rests through the worst heat, retreating to cool rooms on the ground floor, or to the shade of a courtyard if the house has one. The evening meal is more substantial than breakfast. Barley porridge, thick and filling. Perhaps a stew, if there is meat, onions and leeks adding flavour. Fish from the river, if someone has been to market. The family eats together, seated on mats, dipping bread into communal bowls. Markets in Ashur are where those without resources buy their food. Farmers from villages around the city bring produce, barley in sacks, measured out by the jar full, vegetables in season, sheep or goats sold live or butchered on the spot. The market is a place of noise and crowds, merchants calling out their wares, customers haggling over prices. Everything has its price, negotiable, changing with the season and supply. Some families keep chickens in courtyards for eggs and occasional meat. Pigs are raised by some, though they are not as common in Assyria as in Anatolia. Sheep and goats are too valuable to slaughter frequently. They are wealth on the hoof, kept for wool and milk. Meat is a treat, not a daily expectation. Feast days see animals sacrificed, the meat distributed among families, according to complex rules of kinship and status. Beer is brewed at home. It is women's work, like bread making. Barley is soaked, allowed to sprout, dried and ground to make malt. The malt is mixed with water and beer bread, chunks of specially prepared dough. The mixture ferments in large jars, covered and left for several days. The result is thick, sweet, alcoholic. It does not keep long, so it is brewed in small batches as needed. To offer a guest beer is a sign of hospitality, a recognition of status. Wine exists but is expensive, imported from regions to the west where grapes grow abundantly. It is a luxury item, drunk on special occasions by those who can afford it. Most people never taste wine. Beer is the drink of daily life, along with water and occasionally milk, though milk sours quickly in the heat and must be consumed fresh or made into cheese or ghee. Evenings, the family gathers. In winter, around the oven for warmth. In summer, on the roof where any breeze can be felt. Stories are told. Family history passed down orally. Children learn who their ancestors were, what deeds made the family prosperous, what obligations they carry. The tablets record business and law, but oral tradition carries identity. Sleep comes with darkness. Oil lamps are expensive to keep burning. A wick floating in oil, giving just enough light to move around safely, but not enough to work by. Most families sleep when the sun sets, wake when it rises. The rhythm of days is dictated by light and heat, by the work that must be done to survive. It is not an easy life, but it is comprehensible, structured, full of small satisfactions. Bread fresh from the oven, the weight of good textiles in the hands, silver earned and saved, children growing. These are the markers of success in a merchant's world. Ambient interlude. Evening in ancient Ashur. The sun drops toward the western horizon, painting the Tigris a colour like copper. Long shadows stretch across the city, darkening the narrow streets between mud brick houses. The heat of the day begins to release its grip. You can feel it in the air, a gradual cooling that brings relief. On rooftops across Ashur, families emerge to catch the evening breeze. Women carry sleeping mats up the outside stairs, laying them out where the air moves. Children run from roof to roof where houses touch, their voices high and bright in the gathering dusk. Someone is singing, an old song, the words half heard across distance. It mingles with the sound of a dog barking, with the low murmur of conversation, with the clatter of pottery being washed. Smoke rises from 100 cooking fires, carrying the smell of bread, of onions frying, of stew bubbling. The smell of life, of people gathered in small spaces, preparing evening meals. Somewhere, A baby cries, then quiets. Somewhere else, laughter breaks out, sudden and joyful, then fades. The river runs its eternal course below the city walls, the water making its soft sound against the banks. In the temple complex, a drum beats, marking the evening ritual. 3 beats, pause, 3 more. The rhythm is steady, ancient, unchanged for generations. The god is honored as the sun sets, the day is released, the night invited in. Darkness comes quickly when the sun is gone. No gradual twilight here, but a swift transition from day to night. Stars emerge, one by one, then in clusters, then in countless numbers. The sky deepens to black. The city settles. Voices grow quieter. Movement slows. In a sealed room somewhere, tablets stacked on shelves record all of this. All the buying and selling, the marriages and divorces, the loans and inheritances that make up life. But for now, the tablets rest. The day's business is done. There is only the soft night, the cool breeze, the stars overhead, unchanged and unchanging, watching as they have always watched over this small city in the bend of the Tigris. Sleep comes to Ashur, gentle and complete. The merchant families rest. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns, its own work, its own small triumphs and defeats. But tonight, there is peace. Tonight, the city breathes slow and deep, surrendering to the ancient rhythm of sunset and rest. The transformation. The centuries passed. The merchant families of Ashur grew wealthy from their tin and textiles. Their sons travelled the caravan routes, married foreign wives, learned foreign tongues. Their daughters wove and managed households, consecrated themselves to gods, built lives around the rhythms of trade. Silver accumulated. Clay archives filled with the careful records of profit and loss, of marriages and inheritances, of loans extended and debts repaid. This was the world of the merchant empire, a civilization built on calculation and careful planning. But the world was changing around them. To the south, Babylonia grew in power, its kings casting envious eyes northward toward the trade routes. To the east, peoples from the mountains raided the plains, taking what merchants had accumulated over generations. To the west, new powers rose and fell. Ashur found itself vulnerable, its wealth a temptation, its merchant culture ill-suited for defense against armies. The Middle Assyrian period, roughly from the 14th to the 11th centuries BC, marks the Great Turning. The city that had prospered through trade began to learn the arts of war, not because Assyrians loved battle, but because they needed to survive. Kings emerged, who were not merely administrators of commerce, but commanders of armies. The organizational skills that had managed caravans across hundreds of miles were applied to military logistics. The record-keeping that tracked tin shipments was adapted to track soldiers and supplies. The networks of agents and representatives became networks of governors and garrison commanders. The transformation was not instant. For generations, Ashur remained primarily a trading power that could, when necessary, field armies. But gradually, the balance shifted. Military success brought new sources of wealth, tribute from conquered cities that supplemented and eventually rivaled the profits of trade. Young men who might once have walked with caravans now marched with armies. The skills of negotiation and contract were supplemented by the skills of siege and conquest. By the start of the first millennium BC, Assyria was no longer primarily a nation of merchants. It had become a military power, aggressive and expansionist, deploying innovations in warfare that would give it dominance over the ancient Near East for 3 centuries. The old merchant culture did not disappear entirely. Trade continued. Archives were still kept. But the character of Assyrian civilization had fundamentally changed. The question that haunted later generations was whether this transformation was triumph or tragedy. The empire that rose from the ashes of the merchant culture would become the greatest military power the world had yet seen. Its armies would march from Egypt to Iran, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Its cities would shine with unprecedented splendor. Its kings would claim titles that earlier merchants would have found blasphemous, calling themselves rulers of the 4 corners of the earth vice-regents of the god Ashur, shepherds of all peoples. But the cost would be enormous. The careful, calculating culture of the merchants would be replaced by the brutal logic of conquest. The networks of mutual benefit and voluntary exchange would be replaced by networks of compulsion and tribute. The Assyrians would be remembered, but not for their archives and account books. They would be remembered for iron and siege engines, for deported populations and burned cities, for stone reliefs, showing endless processions of tribute bearers and prisoners of war. The transformation had begun. There would be no going back. Iron and innovation. The Assyrian military revolution was built on metal. Iron, specifically, the hard grey metal that when properly worked could hold an edge far better than bronze. The secret of working iron had come from the north, from the Hittite lands of Anatolia, sometime around 1200 BC. When the Hittite Empire collapsed in the chaos that marked the end of the Bronze Age, their smiths scattered, carrying their knowledge to new lands. Assyria was one of the fortunate recipients. Bronze had served for centuries. Copper from Anatolian mines, mixed with tin from the Far East, produced weapons and tools adequate for most purposes. But bronze had limitations. It was expensive. Tin was rare. Its sources distant and uncertain. A bronze sword or spearhead was a significant investment. Armies equipped entirely in bronze required enormous resources. Iron was different. Iron ore was common, found in deposits throughout the Near East. The challenge was not finding it, but working it. Iron melts at a much higher temperature than copper. Early furnaces could not achieve the heat needed to liquefy iron ore. Instead, smiths learned to work it in a semi-solid state, heating it until it was soft enough to hammer, folding it repeatedly to drive out impurities, building up layers of metal that would hold strength and sharpness. The process was labour-intensive and required great skill. Not every smith could work iron successfully, but once mastered, the technique could produce weapons in quantities that bronze could never match. An Assyrian king could arm thousands of soldiers with iron spearheads, iron sword blades, iron arrowheads, all at a fraction of the cost of bronze equipment. This was a revolution in military economics. Iron gave Assyria another advantage. Iron weapons, when properly made, were superior in combat. An iron sword could shatter a bronze sword in direct clash. Iron armour, though heavier than bronze, offered better protection. The psychological impact mattered too. Enemies equipped with bronze faced Assyrian soldiers, gleaming with iron, knowing they were outmatched before the first blow fell. But iron alone did not make Assyrian armies dominant. Innovation extended to tactics and organisation. The Assyrians perfected siege warfare, developing techniques that could reduce even the strongest fortifications. They built siege towers, massive wooden structures on wheels that could be rolled up to city walls, allowing soldiers to fight at the height of the defenders. They used battering rams, great logs capped with iron, suspended from frames and swung repeatedly against gates and walls until stone cracked and wood splintered. They pioneered the use of siege ramps, ordering thousands of workers to pile earth and stone against city walls, building artificial hills that would allow attackers to reach the top of fortifications. The labour was immense, but Assyrian armies had labour in abundance. Prisoners of war, subject populations, entire villages could be conscripted to build these ramps, while the army waited, patient and implacable, for the moment when walls could be topped. The Assyrian cavalry was another innovation. Earlier armies had used chariots, two-wheeled vehicles drawn by horses, carrying a driver and an archer or spearman. Chariots were effective on flat terrain, but clumsy in rough country. The Assyrians developed units of horsemen, soldiers who rode horses directly rather than driving chariots. Early cavalry was limited by the lack of stirrups, which would not be invented for another 1,000 years. Riders had to grip with their legs, making archery from horseback difficult. The Assyrians solved this with paired cavalry. Two horsemen rode together, one controlled both horses, holding their reins. The other was free to use his bow, shooting arrows while his companion managed movement. It was awkward compared to later cavalry tactics, but it worked. Assyrian horsemen could harry enemy flanks, pursue fleeing soldiers, scout terrain ahead of the main army. They gave commanders mobility that infantry alone could never achieve. The army itself was organized with a sophistication that earlier Near Eastern forces had not achieved. There were standing units, professional soldiers who served year-round rather than being called up seasonally from farms. There were specialized corps, archers, spearmen, cavalry, siege engineers. There were logistical units managing supplies, enormous wagon trains that followed armies carrying food, weapons, tools, tents. Everything was recorded, just as merchants had recorded caravans. Scribes accompanied the army, noting supplies consumed, distances marched, enemies killed or captured. Command structure was clear and hierarchical. The king commanded in person when present, but below him were generals who could operate independently. Orders flowed down through officers to common soldiers. Discipline was harsh but effective. An army on campaign moved with a coordination that must have seemed almost inhuman to enemies watching from city walls. Training mattered too. Soldiers drilled in formations, practiced with their weapons, learned to work together as units rather than as individuals. Archery required years to master. A boy would start young, building the arm and shoulder strength needed to draw a warbow, learning to judge distance and wind, to aim at moving targets. And, by the time he joined the army, archery was second nature, as automatic as breathing. The Assyrians also understood terror as a weapon. They deliberately cultivated a reputation for ruthlessness. Cities that resisted faced terrible consequences when finally taken. Populations would be deported, entire communities uprooted, and marched hundreds of miles to be resettled in distant provinces. This served several purposes. It broke the spirit of resistance. It populated empty lands. It created communities of displaced people whose only hope of survival lay in loyalty to Assyria. But it also spread fear. Cities facing Assyrian armies knew what awaited if they chose to resist rather than submit. Psychological warfare extended to royal inscriptions and palace art. Kings boasted in written records of cities destroyed, enemies impaled, rebels flayed alive. Palace reliefs showed torture and execution in graphic detail. Modern sensibilities recoil from these images, but their purpose was clear: to convince potential enemies that resistance was futile and submission the only rational choice. An enemy who surrendered without a fight was more valuable than one who had to be conquered by siege. The result of all these innovations, iron weapons and siegecraft and cavalry and organization and deliberate terror, was a military machine unlike anything the ancient world had yet produced. Assyrian armies could march for months, supply themselves from local resources or from their wagon trains, besiege cities that seemed impregnable, defeat forces many times their size through superior equipment and tactics. For 3 centuries, from roughly 900 to 600 BC, Assyrian military power dominated the Near East. Empires had existed before Assyria, but none had combined size and sophistication so effectively. The Assyrians did not invent empire, but they perfected it, creating systems of conquest and control that later empires would study and imitate for millennia. The army assembles. You stand in ranks on the plain outside Kalhu, one among 10,000. The sun is barely risen, painting the eastern sky the colour of copper. Around you, soldiers adjust armour, check weapons, speak in low voices. The smell is leather and sweat, animals and dust, the sharp scent of iron weapons oiled against rust. You are a spearman, equipped with an iron-tipped spear, taller than yourself, and a rectangular shield, faced with leather over wood. Your armour is scale, hundreds of small bronze plates sewn to a leather backing, covering torso and upper arms. It is heavy. You have learned to carry the weight, to move in it, to fight in it, but you never stop feeling its pressure on your shoulders. To your left, archers stand in their own formations. Their bows are composite, made from wood and horn and sinew, glued together, small enough to draw from horseback, but powerful enough to punch through armour at close range. Each archer carries a quiver of iron-tipped arrows. You have seen what these men can do. Watch them practice on targets, releasing arrow after arrow in smooth rhythm, the shafts flying so thick they darken the air. In battle, they will stand behind the spearmen, shooting over your heads into enemy formations. To your right, cavalry mount their horses. They work in pairs, one man holding the reins of both animals while his companion readies his bow. The horses are nervous, sensing the tension in the camp. They stamp and snort, tossing their heads. The cavalry will scout ahead, harass enemy flanks, pursue fugitives when the battle breaks. They are the eyes of the army, the swift-moving force that fixes enemy positions and exploits weakness. Behind the assembled formations, the siege train waits. Massive wooden towers on wheels, their frames visible against the lightning sky. Battering rams suspended from wheeled frames. Wagons carrying tools, scaling ladders, everything needed to reduce fortified cities. You've seen these machines in action, watched towers roll up to walls while defenders shot arrows and dropped stones, watched rams swing again and again against gates until wood shattered and iron hinges tore free. The siege train is slower than the infantry, but nothing can stand against it indefinitely. Further back, the supply wagons stretch almost to the horizon. Food for the army, grain and dried meat and oil, replacement weapons and armor, tools for making camp, tents for officers, though common soldiers sleep under the sky. The logistics of moving and feeding 10,000 men for months at a time are staggering, but the Assyrian army has mastered them. Scribes track everything, recording consumption, calculating how long supplies will last, determining when foraging parties must be sent out, or tribute demanded from nearby settlements. A horn sounds, deep and brass, echoing across the plain. The formations shift, men tightening ranks, officers calling out orders. You check your gear one final time. Spear, the shaft smooth from years of use. Shield, strapped tight to your left arm. Sword at your belt, a backup weapon in case the spear breaks. Water skin, half full, enough for the day's march. Everything is ready. Another horn call. The formations begin to move, not at once, but in sequence. The cavalry rides out first, disappearing into the early morning light. Then the vanguard, 1,000 men who will march ahead of the main body, their job to secure the route and provide warning of ambush. Then your unit, marching in column, 16 men across and many ranks deep. The precision is beautiful in its way, 10,000 individuals moving as one, disciplined, coordinated, purposeful. You march north. The campaign season has just begun. Winter was spent in garrison, resting, training, repairing equipment. Now the army moves, and cities that have withheld tribute or plotted rebellion will face consequences. You do not know exactly where you will end up. Soldiers are not told the overall plan, only their immediate orders. You will march where commanded, fight who opposes you, take what spoils are offered when cities fall. The pace is steady, not fast but not slow either. 30 kilometers in a day when the road is good, less in rough country. You have done this before. Know the rhythm of military marching. Walk through the morning cool. Rest briefly at midday in whatever shade can be found. March again through the afternoon heat. Camp as evening approaches. Eat whatever food is available. Sleep with your weapons close. Wake and march again. Days blur together, but the purpose remains clear. You are an instrument of Assyrian power, part of a machine designed to project the king's will across vast distances. Your individual existence matters little. What matters is the formation, the army, the inexorable advance of Assyrian dominance over all who would resist. The great kings begin. The reign of Ashurnasirpal II, from 883 to 859 BC, marks the true beginning of Neo-Assyrian imperial expansion. He was not the first of his line to campaign beyond Assyria's borders, but he was the first to do so with such systematic ruthlessness, the first to establish patterns that his successors would follow for centuries. Ashurnasirpal inherited a kingdom that had been slowly rebuilding its power after the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse. His father and grandfather had fought to maintain Assyrian independence against neighbouring threats. Ashurnasirpal went further. He set out to make Assyria not merely secure but dominant, to transform the state from regional power to the centre of a tribute empire that would stretch from the Mediterranean coast to the Zagros Mountains. His method was terror combined with organization. Cities that submitted peacefully were incorporated into the empire with relatively light tribute obligations. Cities that resisted faced destruction so complete and punishment so horrible that news of them spread throughout the region, encouraging others to submit without a fight. Ashurnasirpal's own inscriptions boast of flaying rebel leaders alive, of impaling prisoners on stakes, of building towers from severed heads. Whether these claims are entirely accurate or partly propagandistic exaggeration, they achieved their purpose. The mere approach of Ashurnasirpal's army could prompt surrender. He campaigned relentlessly. Nearly every year of his reign saw military action. He marched north into the mountains, securing routes to metal and timber sources. He marched west to the Euphrates and beyond, bringing Syrian cities under Assyrian control. He marched east into the Zagros, breaking the power of mountain peoples who had raided Assyrian territory. He did not try to hold all this territory directly. Instead, he established a network of vassal states and tribute obligations. Local rulers could keep their thrones as long as they paid what was owed and provided troops when demanded. The tribute was substantial: gold and silver, horses and chariots, copper and iron, luxury goods and raw materials all flowed back to Assyria. Some of this wealth supported the army itself, but much of it funded Ashurnasirpal's building projects. He established a new capital at Kalhu, modern Nimrud, on the banks of the Tigris south of Ashur. There, he built a palace of unprecedented scale and magnificence, its rooms decorated with stone reliefs showing his military victories, its courtyards guarded by massive winged bulls with human heads. The palace was not merely a royal residence. It was a statement of power, a physical manifestation of Assyrian dominance, designed to awe visitors and terrify potential rebels. Provincial governors, vassal kings, and foreign ambassadors who came to Kalhu would walk through rooms depicting Assyrian armies, destroying cities, pursuing fleeing enemies, accepting submission from defeated kings. The message was unmistakable: resist Assyria and be destroyed. Submit and prosper under Assyrian protection. Ashurnasirpal also invested in infrastructure. He built roads and bridges, established supply depots, created a communication system that could transmit messages quickly across the empire. He organized the provinces, appointing governors who reported directly to the king, creating administrative systems that would outlast his reign. The merchant culture of earlier centuries had taught Assyrians to think systematically about logistics and organization. Ashurnasirpal applied these skills to empire building. His successor, Shalmaneser III, reigned from 858 to 824 BC and continued the expansion. Shalmaneser campaigned even more frequently than his father, leading the army on campaigns almost every single year for 3 decades. He pushed deeper into Syria, reaching all the way to the Mediterranean coast. He marched south against Babylon, establishing Assyrian influence over southern Mesopotamia. He fought against coalitions of Syrian and Phoenician cities, breaking their resistance through repeated campaigns. Shalmaneser's most famous battle was at Karkar in 853 BC, where he faced a coalition of Western powers, including King Ahab of Israel. The battle was indecisive, neither side achieving complete victory, but it demonstrated the reach of Assyrian power and the willingness of distant kingdoms to unite against the common threat. Shalmaneser claimed victory in his inscriptions, as kings always did, but the fact that he had to return and campaign in the same region repeatedly suggests that resistance continued. Like his father, Shalmaneser built extensively. He erected stone monuments, called stelae, throughout the empire and beyond, marking the farthest reaches of Assyrian power. He commissioned bronze gates decorated with narrative reliefs showing his victories. He expanded Kalhu, adding new temples and administrative buildings. Everything was recorded, documented, proclaimed. The archives from this period show the bureaucratic sophistication behind the military might, the careful accounting that tracked tribute and troops, supplies and spoils. After Shalmaneser came a period of relative stagnation. Internal troubles, succession disputes, and the rise of the kingdom of Urartu in the north limited Assyrian expansion for several generations. But the patterns had been established. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was no longer just an idea or an ambition. It was a functioning reality, a system of conquest and administration that would be refined and expanded by later kings until Assyria became the dominant power across the entire Near East. The great kings who came after, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, would build on foundations laid by Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser. They would push the borders further, develop administration more thoroughly, create art more magnificent. But the essential pattern, military conquest, combined with systematic administration and deliberate projection of power through both terror and magnificence, was established in the 9th century BC by these two rulers who transformed Assyria from regional kingdom to imperial superpower. Breathing space, the weight of the sword. You carry it at your hip. Always. Even in camp, even when eating or sleeping, the sword stays within reach. It is not particularly long, perhaps 60 centimeters of iron blade with a bronze hilt wrapped in leather for grip. The weight is familiar now, barely noticed after years of carrying it. But there are moments when you feel it, as if for the first time, when its presence becomes heavy with meaning, rather than merely heavy with iron. You have killed men with this sword. Not many. Spears do most of the killing in battle, and arrows even more. But you have used it. You remember the resistance when it struck bone, the way a man's eyes changed when he knew the wound was mortal. Those moments return in quiet times, unwanted, insistent. You do not speak of them. No one does. Soldiers learn to carry such memories in silence, to function despite them, to wake from dreams and prepare for another day's march. The blade requires care. After rain, you must oil it to prevent rust. After battle, you must clean it, removing blood and other substances before they corrode the metal. The edge needs attention too, sharpening when it dulls, checking for nicks that could widen into cracks. You perform these tasks methodically. The routine, a kind of meditation, hands moving through familiar motions while the mind wanders. What do you think about during those long hours of maintenance? Home, perhaps. A wife in Ashur or Kalhu. Children you see only between campaigns. Fields that you once worked before the army claimed you. Friends who did not return from the last battle, their bodies left on some distant field or burned in haste during a retreat. The next campaign, wondering where the army will march when spring comes, what enemies you will face, whether this will be the year your luck runs out. Or perhaps you think about nothing at all. Perhaps you have learned to empty your mind, to exist in the moment without dwelling on past or future. Perhaps that is how you survive, by not thinking too much, by accepting each day as it comes, by focusing on immediate tasks rather than larger questions about purpose and meaning. The sword is just a tool. The army is just where you are. The killing is just what you do. Thinking beyond that brings only trouble, but the weight remains. In quiet moments, you feel it, a burden that is both physical and something else, something that has no name but presses down nonetheless, year after year, campaign after campaign, until you no longer remember who you were before you carried it. The web of empire. By the 8th century BC, Assyria had moved beyond simple conquest. The early pattern of raiding for tribute, of sporadic campaigns that extracted wealth but left local power structures largely intact, had evolved into something more sophisticated and more permanent. The Assyrian Empire, at its height, was not merely a collection of tributary states. It was an integrated system of provinces and vassals, bound together by roads and communication networks, administered by a bureaucracy that would not be matched in scale or efficiency for centuries. The transformation began under Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BC. He inherited an empire in crisis, weakened by internal rebellions and external threats. His response was radical reorganization. Rather than relying on vassal kings whose loyalty was always suspect, he began annexing rebellious territories as provinces under direct Assyrian control. Provincial governors, appointed by the king and answerable only to him, replaced local dynasties. These governors administered justice, collected tribute, maintained order. and provided troops when the army required them. The provincial system grew with each generation. By the time of Ashurbanipal, in the mid-7th century BC, the core of the empire consisted of dozens of provinces, each one governed from a capital city, where an Assyrian official resided with a garrison of soldiers and a staff of scribes and administrators. The provinces stretched from Egypt in the southwest to the Iranian highlands in the northeast, from Anatolia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen. Communication was critical to holding such a vast territory together. The Assyrians developed a road network connecting provincial capitals to the imperial heartland. These were not paved highways in the Roman sense, but they were maintained routes where bridges spanned rivers and way stations provided rest for travelers. Royal messengers could move quickly along these roads, carrying orders from the king to distant governors and bringing back reports on conditions in the provinces. The messenger system was sophisticated. Relay stations were established at regular intervals, perhaps every 40 or 50 kilometers. A messenger carrying urgent dispatches could change horses at each station, allowing for continuous travel day and night. In this way, a message from Nineveh could reach governors in Syria or Elam within a week or two, remarkably fast for the ancient world. The system allowed the central government to stay informed about events throughout the empire and to respond quickly to crises. Information flowed constantly back to the capital. Provincial governors sent regular reports detailing tribute collected, crops harvested, disturbances suppressed, threats detected. The scribes at the royal court compiled this information, maintaining archives that allowed the king and his advisors to track the state of the empire in detail. Archaeological excavations have recovered thousands of administrative tablets from Assyrian sites, recording everything from grain supplies in provincial storehouses, to the movement of military units, to the wages paid to workers on royal building projects. Tribute was the lifeblood of the system. Each province had obligations, specified amounts of grain, livestock, metals, luxury goods, and other resources that had to be delivered annually to royal storehouses. The amounts varied based on the province's wealth and resources. Egyptian provinces sent gold and exotic goods from Africa. Syrian provinces sent wine and textiles. Provinces in the Zagros Mountains sent horses. Babylonian provinces sent dates and grain. All of it was recorded, tracked, redistributed to support the army, the court, and the building projects that proclaimed Assyrian power. Beyond the directly administered provinces lay a ring of vassal states, kingdoms that maintained their own rulers but paid tribute and provided troops to Assyria. These vassals were carefully managed. Assyrian officials monitored them, watching for signs of rebellion or collusion with enemies. Treaties specified obligations in detail. A vassal king who remained loyal could expect Assyrian support against his enemies. A vassal who rebelled faced swift military response and usually annexation as a province. The deportation policy served multiple purposes in this system. When a province or vassal state rebelled, the Assyrians often responded by deporting significant portions of the population. These deportees, sometimes tens of thousands of people, would be marched to distant parts of the empire and resettled in underpopulated areas. This broke the power of local elites, disrupted networks of resistance, and provided labor for agricultural projects and building works. It also created communities of displaced people who had no choice but to depend on Assyrian administration for survival. The policy was brutal but effective. Modern estimates suggest that, over the 3 centuries of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, several million people were forcibly relocated. This created a patchwork of ethnicities and languages throughout the empire, with Aramaic gradually emerging as a common language of administration and commerce. The cosmopolitan nature of the empire, with its mix of peoples and cultures, was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed for economic integration and the spread of technology and ideas, but it also created resentments and yearnings for independence that would eventually contribute to the empire's collapse. The military underpinned everything. Provincial governors commanded garrison troops. The standing army, possibly numbering in the tens of thousands, was supplemented by levies from provinces and vassals when major campaigns were undertaken. Supply depots in each province provided food and weapons for troops on the move. The whole system was designed to project power efficiently, to move large forces quickly to trouble spots, to suppress rebellion before it could spread. At the center sat the king, theoretically absolute in his authority, but in practice dependent on the cooperation of a class of officials and nobles who managed the daily operations of empire. The king made policy, appointed governors, decided when and where the army would campaign. But he relied on information from his administrators, on the loyalty of his generals, on the efficiency of his scribes. The empire was too large for any one person to manage directly. It required institutions, bureaucracies, systems that could function even when kings were incompetent or distracted by other concerns. The result was an empire that could endure setbacks that would have destroyed less organized states. Defeats in battle, rebellions in provinces, succession crises at the center, all occurred during the 3 centuries of Neo-Assyrian power, but the systems held. Provinces continued to function, tribute continued to flow, the army continued to campaign. Only when multiple crises struck simultaneously, when external enemies combined with internal weakness, and the whole structure was stressed beyond its capacity to recover, did the empire finally collapse. Until that moment, the web of empire held, a triumph of organization and systematic administration that would influence how empires were built for millennia to come. Cities of splendor, the capitals of Assyria, were not merely administrative centers. They were showcases of imperial power, designed to overwhelm visitors with the magnificence and might of Assyrian civilization. 3 cities in particular embodied this ambition: Calhu, Dur-Sharrukin, and Nineveh. Each king who built or expanded these capitals sought to outdo his predecessors, creating monuments that would proclaim his glory and intimidate potential enemies. Calhu, the modern site of Nimrud, was established as a royal capital by Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BC. He chose the site strategically on the east bank of the Tigris, about 30 kilometers south of ancient Ashur. The location had access to water, controlled river traffic, and sat at a junction of major roads. Ashurnasirpal built it from essentially nothing into a city of palaces and temples that would serve as an imperial capital for over a century. The centerpiece was Ashurnasirpal's northwest palace, a sprawling complex of courtyards and throne rooms and administrative chambers covering several hectares. The walls were decorated with stone reliefs, room after room of carved limestone panels showing the king hunting lions, besieging cities, receiving tribute from conquered peoples. Colossal stone bulls with wings and human heads, called lamassu, flanked the doorways. These creatures, over 3 meters tall and weighing many tons, were carved from single blocks of stone, quarried in distant mountains, and transported to Calhu at enormous cost. The palace was not just royal residence, but also administrative center. Hundreds of officials worked there, managing the tribute empire, corresponding with provincial governors, recording the business of state on clay tablets. Storerooms held the wealth of empire: silver and gold, ivory and precious woods, textiles and luxury goods from across the known world. When vassal kings came to Calhu to pay homage, they walked through these rooms and saw the physical evidence of Assyrian power accumulated in one place. Calhu grew rapidly. Ashurnasirpal claimed to have settled over 16,000 people there, drawn from various parts of the empire. He built temples to major gods, fortified the city with massive walls, created parks and gardens, supplied with water from canals. His successors expanded the city further. Shalmaneser III added another palace and erected the Black Obelisk, a stone monument covered with reliefs, showing tribute bearers from distant lands presenting exotic gifts: elephants from Syria, camels from Arabia, apes from regions even farther south. 2 centuries later, Sargon II decided that even Calhu's magnificence was insufficient for an Assyrian king. He built an entirely new capital, naming it Dur-Sharrukin, Fortress of Sargon, on a virgin site to the north. The city was planned from the beginning as a unified whole, not grown organically but designed. The walls formed a perfect square, over 7 kilometers around, The palace sat on the city wall itself, its facade visible from outside, a proclamation of royal power. Sargon's palace was enormous, covering over 10 hectares, with over 200 rooms and courtyards arranged around massive halls where the king received visitors and conducted state business. The decoration was even more elaborate than Calhu's. Stone relief covered virtually every wall, glazed bricks in brilliant colours, blues and yellows and greens, decorated facades and doorways. The lamassu at the entrances were even larger than Ashurnasirpal's, towering over visitors. But Dur-Sharrukin was a monument to one king's ambition, and that king's reign was cut short. Sargon died in battle in 705 BC. His son Sennacherib abandoned the new capital, which was never fully completed, and moved back to the old city of Nineveh. There, Sennacherib would create the greatest of all Assyrian capitals, a city that would become synonymous with the empire itself. Nineveh sat on the east bank of the Tigris, across from the modern city of Mosul. It was an ancient site, settled for thousands of years before Sennacherib made it his capital. He transformed it utterly. The city walls were rebuilt to encompass over 700 hectares, making Nineveh one of the largest cities in the world at the time. 15 gates pierced these walls, each one flanked by bull colossi and decorated with glazed brick. Sennacherib called his palace the Palace Without Rival, and the name was not empty, boasting. It was the largest and most elaborate palace complex yet built in Mesopotamia, with over 70 rooms, whose walls were lined with carved stone relief. The scenes depicted showed Sennacherib's victories, his building projects, his reception of tribute. One famous series of reliefs showed the siege and capture of the Judean city of Lachish, depicted in such detail that archaeologists can correlate the carved scenes with the ruins of the actual city. Water was Sennacherib's obsession. He built aqueducts to bring water from mountain springs into Nineveh, creating artificial streams that fed parks and gardens throughout the city. He claimed to have planted every kind of tree and plant from throughout the empire in these gardens. Later, Greek writers would describe the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as one of the wonders of the world, but some modern scholars think the description actually refers to Sennacherib's gardens at Nineveh, misattributed in later tradition. Sennacherib's grandson Ashurbanipal added to Nineveh's splendor. He built his own palace, decorated with reliefs, showing lion hunts of stunning artistry and power. He also created the Great Library, collecting clay tablets from throughout the empire, copying texts from Babylon and Ashur, assembling what was perhaps the largest collection of cuneiform literature in the ancient world. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC and the palace burned, the fire baked these clay tablets hard, preserving them for modern archaeologists to discover over 2,000 years later. The capitals were more than collections of impressive buildings. They were complete urban environments. They were temples to all the major gods, each one a significant structure in its own right. There were barracks for troops, arsenals for weapons and armor. There were administrative buildings where bureaucrats managed the empire. There were markets where goods from across the known world were traded. There were residential quarters for the thousands of people who served the court and staffed the bureaucracy. The cities were also cosmopolitan in their populations. Deportees from dozens of conquered regions lived in Assyrian capitals, bringing their languages and customs and skills. The mix of peoples created a cultural dynamism unusual for the ancient world. Ideas and technology spread more rapidly in this environment. Aramaic, originally the language of Syrian nomads, became the common language of empire, eventually supplementing and then replacing Akkadian as the everyday language even of Assyrians themselves. For someone visiting these capitals in their prime, the experience must have been overwhelming. The sheer scale of the buildings, the wealth displayed in every room, the crowds of officials and soldiers and traders, the sound of dozens of languages being spoken in the markets, the smell of exotic spices and foreign incense in the temples. Everything proclaimed that Assyria was the center of the world, the place where power resided, where tribute from every land accumulated, where the gods had chosen to establish their earthly empire. The palace without rival. The year is 700 BC. Sennacherib has been king for 5 years, and he is determined to build something that will eclipse every palace that came before. Kalhu's splendor is not enough. His father's Dur-Sharrukin, barely completed and already being abandoned, is not enough. Sennacherib will build at Nineveh, the ancient city, and he will make it the greatest capital the world has ever seen. He summons his chief architect, a man whose name is lost to us, but whose work will endure for millennia. Together, they stand on the Acropolis mound at Nineveh, looking out over the site. The old palaces here are centuries old, inadequate for an empire that now stretches from Egypt to Elam. They will be torn down. In their place will rise something unprecedented. The planning takes months. Scribes calculate dimensions, record specifications. How many rooms? Over 70. How large will the throne room be? 50 meters long, its walls lined with stone relief panels. The reliefs themselves will tell the story of Sennacherib's reign, his campaigns, his building projects, his reception of tribute from conquered kings who bow before the throne. Every panel must be carved with precision, the cuneiform inscriptions checking spelling mistakes that could offend the gods or misrepresent the king's achievements. Stone must be quarried. The best limestone comes from hills to the northeast. Days away by ox cart, Sennacherib orders roads built to facilitate transport. Thousands of workers labour to move the massive blocks, some weighing several tons, from quarry to river, loading them onto boats that will float downstream to Nineveh. The lamassu, the colossal winged bulls that will guard the palace gates, require blocks so large that special sleds must be built to move them. The transport of one lamassu becomes an event in itself. The stone block is carved roughly at the quarry, shaped into basic form but not yet detailed. It weighs over 30 tons. Hundreds of men drag it on a sled, pulling on ropes, while others pour water on the ground ahead to reduce friction. The journey takes weeks. When the block finally arrives at Nineveh, sculptors will spend months carving the details. The curled beard, the feathered wings, the inscription running across the body, proclaiming Sennacherib's greatness and the protection these guardians will provide. Inside the palace, relief carvers work in teams. One team specializes in battle scenes, knowing how to depict archers with bows drawn, cavalry charging, infantry in formation. Another team focuses on tribute scenes, carving the endless processions of foreign emissaries bearing gifts, precious metals on trays, exotic animals led on leashes, luxury goods piled high. A third team handles architectural scenes, showing Sennacherib's building projects, the very palace they are decorating, depicted in stone on its own walls. The work is slow and exacting. Each relief panel must fit precisely with its neighbours. The scenes must flow logically from room to room, telling coherent narratives. The cuneiform inscriptions that accompany the images must be carved clearly, each wedge mark perfect. Mistakes require the entire panel to be replaced. The carvers work in workshops near the palace, measuring and carving before the panels are set into the walls. Sennacherib visits the construction site frequently. He inspects the work, orders changes, demands higher standards. When a relief is completed that particularly pleases him, he rewards the sculptors. When work is shoddy, he has it torn out and redone. He is building his legacy in stone, the physical manifestation of his reign that will outlast his lifetime. Every detail matters. The palace is not built by slaves, despite what later legend would suggest. The workers are paid, receiving rations of grain and oil, beer and meat. Skilled craftsmen, the carvers and engineers and master builders, receive higher compensation. The labour force is enormous, thousands of men working simultaneously on different parts of the complex. Organisational skills honed over centuries of managing merchant caravans and military campaigns are applied to construction. Supply lines bring in materials, foremen direct teams, scribes record everything, tracking costs and progress. Water is Sennacherib's passion. The palace will need water for its gardens, for its courtyards, for the king's comfort. He orders an aqueduct built, bringing water from mountain springs over 50 kilometers away. The engineering is sophisticated, calculating gradients so water will flow by gravity alone, building stone channels that cross valleys on elevated structures. When complete, the aqueduct delivers fresh water directly into the palace grounds, feeding pools and fountains, irrigating the gardens where trees from throughout the empire grow side by side. Years pass, the palace takes shape, walls rise, rooms are roofed with cedar beams from Lebanon, floors are paved with stone or baked brick. The relief panels are set in place, transforming blank mud brick into narrative walls that shimmer in lamplight. Doorways are hung with bronze doors, their surfaces decorated with hammered reliefs. The throne room is completed, its walls showing Sennacherib in triumph, receiving the submission of enemy kings, demonstrating the power of Assyria, made visible and permanent. Finally, the dedication. Sennacherib holds a great feast, inviting nobles and officials, foreign ambassadors, anyone important enough to matter. They walk through the completed palace, viewing room after room of magnificence. They stand in the throne room, craning their necks to see the full height of the walls. They walk through gardens fed by the new aqueduct, admiring trees and plants from distant lands growing together in ordered beauty. Everything is designed to overwhelm, to demonstrate that Assyrian power is not merely military might, but also administrative sophistication and artistic achievement. Sennacherib sits on his throne, receiving homage. The palace lives up to its name. There is no rival. Everything about it proclaims supremacy, permanence, the eternal dominance of Assyria over all the lands. The king is satisfied. His monument is complete. He does not know that in barely a century, this palace will burn, that the empire it represents will collapse with shocking suddenness, that the relief panels showing Assyrian triumph will be buried under debris for over 2,000 years before archaeologists unearth them, revealing to a later age the magnificence and the hubris of the civilization that built this palace without rival. Stone guardians. They stood at the thresholds, massive and implacable, neither quite beast nor human, but something that transcended both. The Lamassu, the Assyrians called them. We have no better name. Winged bulls with human heads, carved from single blocks of stone that weighed many tons, set at the entrances to palaces and temples, to guard against evil and proclaim the power of the king who commanded their creation. The form itself was ancient, drawing on thousands of years of Mesopotamian tradition. Bulls represented strength and fertility. Wings symbolized divine nature, the ability to move between earth and heaven. The human head, bearded and crowned, represented intelligence and kingship. Combined, these elements created protective spirits that were more than merely decorative. The Assyrians believed these statues had genuine power, that they actively defended the spaces they guarded against malevolent forces, spiritual and human. The carving process was an achievement of engineering and artistry. The stone blocks, limestone or alabaster, were selected at quarries for size and quality. They were rough-shaped at the quarry site, reducing weight for transport but leaving excess stone for final carving. The journey to the capital, whether Kalhu or Nineveh or Dur-Sharukin, involved hundreds of workers dragging the blocks on sleds, using ramps and rollers, crossing rivers on specially built rafts. A single lamassu might take months to transport. Once at the construction site, the real artistry began. Sculptors worked from scaffolding, gradually revealing the form within the stone. The body was carved in profile, muscular and powerful. The wings spread upward and back, each feather individually defined. The human head faced forward, its features standardized according to conventions of royal iconography. The beard was curled in tight rows. The crown, a cylindrical tiara topped with feathers, sat firmly on the head. A clever innovation made the lamassu work from multiple viewing angles. When seen from the front, the bull appeared to stand still, 4 legs visible. When seen from the side, it appeared to walk forward, 4 legs again visible, because an extra 5th leg was carved. The illusion was subtle but effective, the guardian appearing both static and dynamic, depending on the viewer's position. The surfaces were finished smooth, then covered with inscriptions. Cuneiform texts ran across the body, proclaiming the king's titles and achievements, invoking divine protection for the palace, cursing anyone who would damage the statue. The inscriptions made the lamassu not merely decorative, but textual, physical embodiments of royal authority expressed in written form. Colour completed the transformation. The lamassu were not left as bare stone. They were painted, their bodies white or cream-coloured, their beards black or dark blue, the feathers of wings picked out in red and yellow. Eyes were inlaid with precious stones that caught lamplight, making the statues seem almost alive. The visual impact of a fully painted lamassu in a doorway, towering over human scale, must have been tremendous. They were set in pairs, flanking doorways into throne rooms or courtyards. The placement was ceremonial and protective. Anyone entering the palace had to pass between these guardians, had to walk beneath their gaze, had to acknowledge implicitly the power they represented. For foreign ambassadors or tribute bearers, the experience reinforced messages of Assyrian dominance. For the king and his court, the lamassu provided psychological assurance of divine protection and legitimacy. Beyond the lamassu, the stone relief panels that lined palace walls created an entire visual program of imperial propaganda. Room after room showed Assyrian military victories, sieges and battles depicted in meticulous detail. Enemies fled before Assyrian troops. Cities fell to Assyrian siege engines. Prisoners were paraded before the king. The scenes were not random, but carefully organized to create narratives that anyone, even the illiterate, could follow and understand. The style was sophisticated. The carvers understood perspective and movement. Muscles were rendered accurately. Clothing fell in naturalistic folds. Faces showed expression, fear on defeated enemies, calm confidence on Assyrian soldiers. Animals were depicted with particular skill. Horses in battle scenes moved with convincing energy. Lions in hunting scenes displayed terrifying power, even as arrows pierced their bodies. The hunting scenes, especially those from Ashurbanipal's palace, reached a pinnacle of artistic achievement. The king hunted lions, not in the wild, but in controlled royal hunts, where lions were released in arenas to be killed by the king from his chariot. The reliefs show the entire sequence. Lions released from cages, the king drawing his bow, arrows striking home, wounded lions roaring in defiance or pain, dead lions being carried away by attendants. The artistry transcends propaganda, becoming genuine art that conveys motion and emotion across millennia, but the purpose was always political. The reliefs were not art for art's sake. They were communication tools, visual texts that proclaimed specific messages about Assyrian power and royal legitimacy. The king was protector of civilization against chaos, represented by wild beasts. He was victorious over human enemies. He was pious, making offerings to gods. He was magnificent, receiving tribute from all corners of the earth. Every panel reinforced these themes, creating an environment where Assyrian supremacy seemed natural, inevitable, divinely ordained. The stone guardians and the reliefs they accompanied represent one of the great artistic achievements of the ancient world. Assyrian court art influenced later empires, Persian and Greek and Roman. The tradition of monumental stone sculpture, of narrative relief telling stories in sequential panels, of colossal guardian figures protecting sacred spaces, all have roots in Assyrian practice. When Persian kings built palaces at Persepolis, they employed Assyrian styles and techniques. When Roman emperors erected triumphal columns showing military victories, they followed patterns established in Assyrian palaces. But the stones were more than aesthetic objects or historical influences. They were presences, powerful and enduring. When the empire fell and the palaces burned, the reliefs survived, buried under debris, waiting. When 19th century archaeologists excavated Nineveh and Kalhu, the lamassu and relief panels emerged from the earth, still powerful, still imposing. Now they stand in museums, in London and Paris, and Baghdad. Silent guardians watching over spaces far different from the palace courtyards they once protected. The empires that created them are dust, but the stones endure, testament to the artistic achievement and the imperial ambitions of a civilization that believed its dominance would last forever. Walking through Ashurbanipal's library, you enter through a doorway flanked by lamassu, their stone eyes watching as you pass beneath. The room beyond is large but not palatial, its walls undecorated mud brick rather than carved relief. This is a working space, Not a throne room meant to impress foreign visitors. This is where knowledge lives. The tablets are everywhere. On shelves along the walls, stacked carefully with labels indicating contents, in clay jars, sealed against moisture and dust. On tables where scribes work, copying texts, collating versions, checking for errors. The smell is earth and old clay, the faint mustiness of documents that have lain untouched for years, mixed with the fresh scent of newly written tablets drying in the air. You pick up a tablet from a nearby shelf. It fits in your hand, rectangular, covered with cuneiform script pressed into the clay when it was soft. The writing is dense, filling both sides of the tablet with barely a gap. You cannot read it. This ancient script requires years of training, but you can see that it is carefully done. Each sign pressed with precision, each line straight. A scribe notices you, approaches. What does this contain, you ask? The scribe takes the tablet, glances at it, answers without hesitation. A medical text, prescriptions for treating fever, combinations of herbs and minerals, specified dosages, incantations to accompany the medicine. This particular tablet is a copy, he explains, made from an original found in Babylon. The king ordered copies, made of all important texts from southern cities, bringing their knowledge north to be preserved here in Nineveh. You walk deeper into the library. Another room contains literary works. The scribe shows you the Epic of Gilgamesh. Not a single tablet, but a series of them, 12 in total, telling the story of the ancient king who sought immortality and learned the limitations of human existence. There are multiple copies of each tablet, the scribe explains, in case one is damaged. The text must be preserved exactly, every word in its proper place. Another shelf holds omen texts, records of divination going back centuries. If a woman gives birth to twins, and the first is male, the omen is favourable for the king. If lightning strikes from the east on a cloudless day, rebellion threatens. If the liver of the sacrificed sheep shows a certain marking, military campaign should be delayed. Thousands of observations, compiled and organised, the accumulated wisdom of generations of diviners who studied signs and sought to read the will of gods in natural phenomena. There are astronomical texts, tracking the movements of planets across the night sky, recording eclipses, calculating cycles, mathematical tablets with exercises in multiplication and division, geometric problems, calculations of volumes and areas needed for construction projects, ritual texts describing proper conduct for festivals, the exact words to be spoken at certain moments, the order of processions, the types of offerings appropriate for each god. Historical texts preserve the annals of kings, their campaigns recorded year by year. Literary compositions include hymns, praising gods, prayers for specific occasions, laments over destroyed cities. Legal texts collect laws and precedents, cases heard and decided, principles that should govern justice. Reference texts list plants and animals, rivers and mountains, explaining each category of created things. The scribes who work here are specialists. One knows medicine, another astronomy, another focuses on divination, another on literature. They collaborate, discuss difficult passages, compare variant readings when different copies of a text disagree. The king has commanded them to collect all knowledge, to make Nineveh the repository of Mesopotamian wisdom. Texts are brought from Babylon and Ashur, from temple archives and palace libraries throughout the empire. Everything is copied, organized, preserved. You watch a scribe at work, copying a text onto a fresh tablet. His stylus moves quickly but carefully, each cuneiform sign formed with practiced efficiency. When he completes a line, he refers back to the original, checking his work. Mistakes are rare, but serious. A single wrong sign can change meaning, could transmit error to future generations. The work requires intense concentration. Why does the king do this, you ask? Why gather all this knowledge? These thousands of tablets. The scribe pauses in his work, considers the question. Knowledge is power, he says, to understand the will of gods through divination, to diagnose and treat disease, to track the heavens and predict celestial events. to preserve the wisdom of the past. All of this makes the king powerful. But there is more. The king loves learning for its own sake. He can read cuneiform himself, unusual for a king. He comes here sometimes, reads tablets, discusses texts with the scribes. He understands that this library is a treasure as valuable as silver or gold. You look around the room again, trying to comprehend the scale. How many tablets are here? Tens of thousands, the scribe estimates, perhaps more. The exact count is uncertain. New texts arrive regularly. Copies are still being made of text from distant archives. When complete, this collection will be the largest in the world, surpassing even the great libraries of Babylon. You hold another tablet, feeling the weight of it in your hand. This particular one is a love poem, written in Sumerian, a language already ancient when the Assyrian Empire rose. Someone composed this centuries ago, before Assyria existed, before Babylon was great. And now it is here, preserved and copied. Its words available to be read by anyone with the training to decipher cuneiform. The past speaks through these clay rectangles, voices across vast time made present through the simple technology of pressing reed into soft clay. You set the tablet down carefully, reverently. This is not a throne room full of carved boasts of military triumph. This is different. This is an attempt to gather and preserve understanding, to collect the accumulated knowledge of civilization in one place. It is monument not to conquest but to learning, to the idea that knowledge matters, that the wisdom of the past should not be lost but treasured and transmitted to the future. You do not know that this library will burn when Nineveh falls, that the palace will be destroyed and the tablets buried under collapsed walls and debris. You do not know that the fire will bake the clay tablets hard, preserving them better than any deliberate attempt at preservation could have done. You do not know that 26 centuries later, archaeologists will excavate this room and ship the tablets to museums where specialists will spend lifetimes translating and studying them, recovering the wisdom Ashurbanipal gathered. You only know that you stand in a place where knowledge lives, where the past is present, where the careful work of scribes across centuries has been collected and organized and made available. The library waits, patient and permanent, ready to speak to anyone with ears to hear. The scribes and their wisdom. The scribal class in Assyria occupied a position of influence and prestige unusual for the ancient world. These were the literate elite, men who had spent years mastering the complex cuneiform writing system, who could read and compose texts in Akkadian, and often in Sumerian as well, who served as the bureaucratic backbone of empire and the guardians of intellectual tradition. Training began young. A boy destined for the scribal profession, typically the son of a scribe or wealthy family, would enter scribal school around age 6 or 7. The curriculum was demanding. First came the basics of cuneiform, learning to form each of the hundreds of signs by pressing a reed stylus into clay. Students worked on practice tablets, copying lists of signs until their hands could form them automatically. The lists themselves were pedagogical texts, organizing signs by shape or sound, teaching vocabulary and grammar simultaneously with writing mechanics. Advanced training moved beyond sign lists to actual texts. Students copied literary works, learning grammar and style through imitation. They worked through mathematical problems, calculating areas and volumes. They studied legal formulas, memorizing the proper language for contracts and court decisions. They learned omens, memorizing the complex correlations between observed phenomena and predicted outcomes. The complete training could take 10 or 15 years, producing scholars who were not merely literate but broadly educated in multiple disciplines. The scribal profession was not monolithic. Specializations developed. Some scribes focused on administration, managing the empire's bureaucracy, recording tribute and expenses, corresponding with provincial governors. These men were essential to imperial function, translating royal commands into actionable orders, compiling information from across the empire, maintaining the archives that allowed central government to track conditions in distant provinces. Other scribes specialized in divination, the art of reading omens to determine divine will. This was serious business in Assyrian thought. Major decisions, military campaigns, building projects, diplomatic initiatives, all required consultation with diviners who would interpret signs and advise whether the time was auspicious. The primary method was haruspicy, examining the liver of sacrificed sheep. The liver's shape and markings were believed to reflect divine intentions. Diviners consulted elaborate reference texts, correlating specific liver features with predicted outcomes. Astronomical observation was another specialized field. Scribes tracked the movements of planets, recorded eclipses, compiled data over years and decades. The purpose was partly practical, determining calendars and festival dates, but also divinatory. Celestial phenomena were believed to presage earthly events. An eclipse might predict the death of a king. The appearance of a comet could herald military disaster or triumph. Astronomical scribes maintained continuous watch of the heavens, reporting unusual phenomena to the royal court. Medical knowledge was preserved and transmitted by specialized scribes. Assyrian medicine combined empirical observation with magical practice. Some treatments were straightforward. Certain herbs reduced fever, specific salves healed wounds, particular diets strengthened patients. Other treatments involved incantations, rituals designed to drive away the demons or angry ghosts believed to cause disease. Medical texts documented both approaches, recording symptoms and remedies, preserving a body of knowledge accumulated over centuries. Literary scribes preserved and created texts that would outlast the empire itself. They copied and maintained the Epic of Gilgamesh, the foundational work of Mesopotamian literature. They composed royal inscriptions in elevated language, praising kings and describing their achievements. They wrote hymns to gods, prayers for specific occasions, wisdom literature exploring questions of justice and theodicy. The famous Babylonian Theodicy, a dialogue exploring why the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper, was known and copied in Assyria, its questions resonating across cultures. Scholarly collaboration existed. Scribes corresponded with each other, discussed difficult textual problems, compared variant readings when different copies of a text contained discrepancies. The library at Nineveh facilitated this, bringing together texts from across Mesopotamia, allowing scholars to work with comprehensive collections. Letters survive, showing scribes debating the correct reading of obscure signs, arguing over interpretations of omens, sharing discoveries. The position brought substantial rewards. Scribes in royal service received regular salaries, land grants, houses. Senior scribes, those who served as royal advisors or managed major administrative departments, could accumulate considerable wealth and influence. A scribe who excelled at his work might receive gifts from the king, gold rings or fine garments. Scribal families formed something of an aristocracy of knowledge, passing expertise from father to son across generations. But the work also carried burdens. Scribes served at royal pleasure. A king dissatisfied with an omen, interpretation, or angered by administrative failures might punish the scribes responsible. The work itself was exacting, requiring precision and concentration. A clerk who made errors in accounts could cause financial loss. A diviner who misread omens might be blamed if predictions proved wrong. The responsibility of advising kings on matters of war and peace weighed heavily. The intellectual life of Assyria, preserved in tens of thousands of tablets from sites like Nineveh, reveals a civilization deeply concerned with understanding the world. The Assyrians inherited and built upon Mesopotamian traditions, going back thousands of years. They saw themselves as part of a long continuum of knowledge, preserving texts from earlier periods while contributing their own observations and interpretations. Mathematics was practical but sophisticated. Scribes could solve complex algebraic problems, calculate compound interest, determine areas of irregular shapes. The base 60-number system they inherited from Sumer remains with us in how we measure time and angles. Geometry was well developed, necessary for architecture and land surveying. The mathematical texts show abstract thinking alongside practical applications. Natural observation was keen. Lists categorized plants by type, describing their properties and uses. Animals were similarly classified. Mineral substances were catalogued. Geographic knowledge extended across the known world, with texts describing distant lands, their peoples, their products. The Assyrians were cosmopolitan, their empire bringing them into contact with diverse cultures, and this diversity is reflected in their scholarly texts. The scribal achievement was fundamentally preservationist. They saw their role as maintaining knowledge, passing it intact to future generations. The emphasis on copying texts accurately, on comparing versions to establish correct readings, on organizing information systematically, all reflect a culture that valued continuity and preservation over innovation. There were certainly developments and new compositions, but the dominant ethos was conservative, seeking to preserve rather than to revolutionize. When Nineveh fell and the library burned, this whole intellectual world was disrupted. The cuneiform tradition would continue in Babylon for some centuries, but the sophisticated scholarly culture centered in Assyrian royal courts was destroyed. The tablets baked in the fires would eventually be recovered, translated, studied. Modern understanding of Mesopotamian civilization rests substantially on what Assyrian scribes preserved in Ashurbanipal's library and in other archives throughout the empire. The scribes were ultimately successful in their preservationist mission, though not in the way they imagined. They sought to maintain knowledge for their own civilization and its successors in Mesopotamia. They could not have anticipated that their texts would be read by scholars thousands of years later, in languages that did not yet exist, in cultures they could not have conceived. But that is what happened. The wisdom they so carefully recorded speaks across millennia, testament to their skill and their commitment to preserving what they valued most: knowledge itself. Ambient interlude. Morning in Nineveh. The sun rises over the eastern wall, its light flooding across the rooftops of the greatest city in the world. Nineveh wakes slowly, gradually, as the cool of night gives way to morning warmth. The Tigris flows past the western walls, its waters catching the early light, reflecting silver and gold. In 1,000 courtyards, fires are kindled. The smell of bread baking drifts through narrow streets. Smoke rises, thin columns that merge into a haze over the city. Somewhere, a donkey brays, the sound echoing off mud brick walls. A dog barks in answer, then falls silent. The city breathes, draws in morning air, prepares for the day's work. The markets are already stirring. Vendors set up stalls, arranging produce, calling out to each other in a dozen languages. Aramaic and Akkadian mix with Egyptian and Elamite, with tongues from mountains and coasts, from deserts and river valleys. Nineveh is the heart of empire, and all the world flows through its gates. Temple bells ring, marking the hour of morning prayer. In the great temple of Ishtar, priests begin their chants, ancient words in an ancient language, maintaining rituals performed for centuries. The sound drifts across the city, familiar, comforting, a reminder that gods watch over this place. In the palace, scribes are already at their tablets, recording the business of empire. Correspondence from provincial governors waits to be read, reports on tribute collections, on harvest conditions, on potential troubles in distant regions. The work never stops. The empire requires constant attention, constant management. The scribes bend to their task, styluses moving across clay, building the written record that makes administration possible. Soldiers drill in the great court, their movements synchronized, shields forming walls, spears rising and falling in unison. The sound of their practice echoes, bronze on bronze, leather on stone. An officer barks commands. The formations shift, turn, advance. Even in peace, the army must be ready. Nineveh's magnificence rests on military power, and that power must be maintained through constant practice. Children run through streets, their voices high and clear, calling to each other in play. An old woman sweeps her threshold, the rhythmic sound of her broom marking time. Water sellers move through neighborhoods, their calls advertising fresh water from the king's aqueduct. Life proceeds in its ordinary patterns, thousands of individual existences woven together into the fabric of urban life. The light strengthens, the day takes hold. Nineveh is awake, functioning, living. From the palace on its acropolis to the humblest dwelling in the outer quarters, the city moves forward into another day of commerce and administration, worship and work. The daily rhythms that continue, regardless of what kings decree or armies accomplish. The empire may span from Egypt to Elam, but here, in this moment, what matters is the bread baking, the water fetched, the work begun. Mourning in Nineveh, like mourning anywhere, brings its own concerns and its own small satisfactions. The sun climbs higher, the city settles into its routines. Another day begins in the capital of the world. The shadows lengthen. By the middle of the 7th century BC, Assyria appeared invincible. Ashurbanipal's armies had marched to Egypt, installing and removing pharaohs at will. They had crushed Elam to the east, destroying its capital at Susa. They had suppressed revolts in Babylon, maintaining Assyrian dominance over southern Mesopotamia. The empire stretched farther than ever before. Tribute flowed from dozens of provinces. The capital, at Nineveh, gleamed with unprecedented magnificence. To anyone observing Assyrian power in 650 BC, the empire must have seemed eternal. But cracks were forming beneath the surface. The very size of the empire created problems that proved increasingly difficult to solve. Maintaining control over such vast territories required constant military campaigns. Provinces that seemed pacified would rebel when the army marched elsewhere. Vassal kings plotted against Assyrian overlordship, seeking opportunities to break free. The burden of keeping so many people subordinate through force and threat of force was exhausting the empire's resources. The deportation policy, effective in the short term at breaking resistance, created long-term instability. Millions of displaced people, scattered throughout the empire, harbored resentments. They remembered their homelands, their former independence. They waited for chances to revolt. The cosmopolitan mixing of populations that had seemed a strength, binding the empire together through shared administration and commerce, became a weakness when central authority faltered. The military itself showed signs of strain. Constant campaigning depleted manpower. The core of professional Assyrian soldiers was supplemented increasingly by troops levied from subject provinces, men whose loyalty to Assyria was questionable. Maintaining the technological edge that had given Assyrian armies their dominance required continual investment in weapons and training. As neighbours learned Assyrian techniques, as iron weapons spread throughout the region, the advantages that had seemed insurmountable eroded. Economic pressures mounted. The tribute system, for all its sophistication, was fundamentally extractive. It took wealth from provinces without creating sustainable local prosperity. Regions that had been productive before Assyrian conquest became impoverished under the burden of annual tribute obligations. Over time, the provinces had less to give. The flow of silver and gold that had enriched Nineveh slowed. Building projects that earlier kings had completed in years now took decades, or were abandoned half-finished. Internal politics became increasingly unstable. After Ashurbanipal's death around 631 BC, the succession was contested. Multiple claimants fought for the throne. Provincial governors, commanding their own armies, could defy central authority with increasing boldness. The careful administrative systems that had held the empire together required strong kings to maintain them. Weak or divided leadership allowed the system to fracture. New powers were rising on Assyria's borders. To the east, the Medes were organizing into a formidable kingdom, uniting Persian tribes under centralized leadership. To the south, Babylon was reasserting independence under the Chaldean dynasty. These were not the disorganized peoples Assyria had conquered in earlier centuries. They had learned from Assyrian examples, adopting military techniques and administrative practices. They understood how the empire worked, and therefore understood its vulnerabilities. The final crisis, when it came, was swift and overwhelming. In 616 BC, a coalition formed between the Medes and Babylonians. This was the nightmare scenario for Assyrian strategists: coordinated attack from multiple directions by enemies strong enough to threaten the heartland. The Assyrian army, spread thin across the empire, could not concentrate forces quickly enough to meet both threats. The Medes struck from the east, driving into Assyrian territory, capturing cities that had been secure for centuries. The Babylonians advanced from the south, reclaiming territories in Mesopotamia. The Assyrian military response was hampered by internal divisions. Generals disagreed on strategy. Provincial governors withheld troops, calculating that the empire's collapse might present opportunities for their own advancement. Subject peoples sensed weakness and revolted. Provinces that had submitted to Assyria for generations saw their chance to break free. Rather than fighting to preserve the empire, they fought to destroy it, joining the Medes and Babylonians, or simply refusing to provide the troops and supplies Assyria desperately needed. The administrative systems that had seemed so robust unraveled with shocking speed. Tribute stopped flowing. Communication networks broke down. So, the web of empire, so carefully woven over centuries, came apart. By 614 BC, the situation was desperate. The Medes and Babylonians were advancing on Assyria's heartland, on the core territories along the Tigris that had been secure since the empire's founding. Cities fell. Ashur, the ancient capital, the city from which everything had begun, was taken and destroyed. The survivors fled north, carrying what they could, abandoning the city that had stood for over 2,000 years. Nineveh remained, the last stronghold of Assyrian power. The great walls that Sennacherib had built, the palaces, the temples, the library, the accumulated treasures of empire, all concentrated in one city. The remnants of the Assyrian army gathered there. Refugees from fallen cities crowded the streets. Everyone understood what was coming. The coalition was marching on Nineveh. The final siege was beginning. The shadows were lengthening. The long day of Assyrian power was drawing towards sunset. Within 2 years, everything that had been built over 3 centuries would be reduced to burning ruins and silence. The fall of Nineveh. The siege began in 613 BC. The combined armies of the Medes and Babylonians surrounded Nineveh, cutting it off from the outside world. The great walls that had seemed impregnable now became a prison, trapping defenders and refugees alike inside the dying capital. The city that had besieged so many others now experienced siege itself, learning what it meant to watch enemies from walls, while hope dwindled day by day. The defenders had supplies. Nineveh's storehouses held grain enough to feed the population for months, perhaps even years. The aqueducts that Sennacherib had built still brought fresh water from mountain springs. The walls were thick and high, built to resist exactly this kind of attack. Assyrian military engineers had designed these fortifications, knowing that someday they might face the very siege techniques Assyria had perfected. The city could hold, theoretically, indefinitely. But morale was the real weakness. The defenders knew they were the last remnant of a collapsing empire. No relief force was coming. The provinces were lost. The vassal kings had either joined the attackers or declared neutrality. Nineveh stood alone, and everyone inside understood that alone it could not ultimately prevail. The question was not whether the city would fall, but when, and what terms might be negotiated if surrender came before complete destruction. The attackers were patient. They had learned siegecraft from Assyrian campaigns, had studied the techniques that had reduced so many cities over the centuries. They built siege works methodically, gradually tightening their grip. They cut off escape routes, intercepted anyone trying to flee, prevented any communication with the outside. They waited, knowing that time favoured them, that each week that passed weakened the defenders further. Months went by. Inside Nineveh, conditions deteriorated. Food supplies, however substantial initially, began to run low. Rationing was imposed. The social fabric of the city, already strained by the influx of refugees from fallen territories, started to fray. Arguments broke out over distributions of food. Crime increased as desperate peoples stole what they could. The authority that had governed an empire struggled to maintain order within a single besieged city. Disease followed hunger. In crowded, unsanitary conditions, illness spread quickly. The weak died first, the very young and very old, those already malnourished or injured. The dead had to be buried somewhere, but space was limited. Mass graves were dug within the city. The smell of death mingled with the smell of too many people living in too small a space. The city that had been magnificent became desperate. The final assault came in 612 BC. The attackers, judging that the defenders were sufficiently weakened, launched coordinated attacks on multiple gates. Siege engines battered the walls. Scaling ladders went up. The defenders fought with the energy of desperation, knowing this was the end. But they were too few, too exhausted, too demoralized. The walls were breached. Enemy soldiers poured into the city. What followed was the fate Nineveh had imposed on so many other cities. The slaughter was extensive. Soldiers killed anyone who resisted. The palaces were looted. Treasures accumulated over centuries carried away as spoils. The temples were desecrated, their gold and silver stripped. Fire was set, deliberately, to prevent any possibility of the city being reoccupied and defended again. The flames spread from building to building, consuming wood and fabric, baking clay brick until walls cracked from heat. The library burned. Ashurbanipal's carefully assembled collection of tens of thousands of tablets, the gathered wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization, was consumed in fire, but in a strange irony, the fire that destroyed the palace preserved the library. The intense heat baked the clay tablets harder than they had been, transforming them from sun-dried clay to ceramic that would survive for millennia. They fell as the palace collapsed, buried under debris, waiting in darkness for their eventual rediscovery. The city burned for days. Smoke rose in a column visible from great distances, a signal to all who saw it that the impossible had happened, that Nineveh had fallen, that Assyria was finished. When the fires finally died, what remained was rubble and ash, bodies and broken walls. The palaces that had hosted foreign ambassadors and displayed the wealth of empire were ruins. The temples where gods had been worshipped for centuries were empty shells. The houses where tens of thousands had lived were collapsed and charred. Some survivors escaped during the chaos, fled to the north where remnants of Assyrian forces tried to maintain resistance for a few more years. But this was merely epilogue. The fall of Nineveh was the end of the empire. A few Assyrian holdouts in western cities would be eliminated over the next decade. The identity of Assyria as a political and military power ceased to exist. The empire that had seemed eternal, that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries, vanished with shocking finality. The victors divided the spoils. Media took the northern territories. Babylon claimed the south. The two powers that had united to destroy Assyria now became rivals themselves. But that is another story. For Assyria, for Nineveh, there was only silence. The smoke cleared, the ruins cooled. The Tigris continued to flow past broken walls, and gradually, over years and decades and centuries, the defeated capital was abandoned, left to the wind and weather, slowly buried under accumulating soil as time moved forward and memory faded. Breathing space. When the fires died, the smoke has cleared. The ruins are still warm, but no longer burning. The great city is silent now, no voices calling in its markets, no drums beating in its temples, no soldiers drilling in its courtyards, just wind moving through broken walls, stirring ash, carrying the faint smell of burning that will linger for months. Nothing moves in the streets. The bodies have been left where they fell, too many to bury, or have been carried away by survivors who managed to escape. The palaces stand open to the sky, their roofs collapsed, their walls cracked by heat. The stone guardians, the mighty lamassu that guarded doorways, watch over emptiness now. Their painted surfaces are blackened. Their inscriptions proclaim the power of kings who are dead, the greatness of an empire that no longer exists. In the rubble of the library, tablets lie buried, the knowledge of centuries, the wisdom so carefully preserved, the texts copied and organized and treasured. All of it is hidden now under fallen brick and timbers. The scribes who worked there are gone. No one reads these tablets anymore. They rest in darkness, patient, waiting for a time that will not come for over 2,000 years. The river keeps flowing. The Tigris does not care about empires. It flowed before Assyria rose. It flows now that Assyria has fallen. It will flow when all memory of this civilization has faded from human knowledge. The water is indifferent to human ambition, to triumph and catastrophe alike. It simply flows, carrying silt from distant mountains down to the southern sea. Somewhere in the ruins, a bird calls. Life is already returning, finding spaces in the destruction. adapting to the new reality of stone and silence. In time, grass will grow between the fallen stones, trees will take root in the rubble, animals will make dens in what were once palace rooms. Nature reclaims what humans built, patient and persistent, transforming monuments back into earth. The great city sleeps now, a sleep that will last longer than it lived. The power that terrified nations is broken, the wealth that filled storehouses is scattered, the knowledge that filled libraries is hidden, the people who walked these streets are dead or fled. What remains is stone and clay and memory slowly fading. The fires are out, the smoke has cleared, silence settles over Nineveh like snow, soft and complete. The age of Assyria has ended, the long forgetting has begun. Buried in time, the decades passed. A generation grew up that had not seen Nineveh in its glory, had only heard stories from grandparents about the great city and its power. To these children, Assyria was already becoming legend, something that had existed once but seemed almost mythical in its distance from present reality. The Medes and Babylonians, who had destroyed the empire, quarrelled over the spoils, fought their own wars, built their own monuments. Nineveh's ruins were of no interest to them, just stones from a defeated enemy. More time passed. Babylon rose to brief glory under Nebuchadnezzar, conquering Jerusalem, deporting the Jews, building palaces and hanging gardens that later ages would count among the wonders of the world. Then Babylon too fell, conquered by the Persians who built an even larger empire, stretching from India to Greece. The Persians knew about Assyria from written records, but the cities themselves were already ruins, tells rising from the plain, their true history obscured by accumulating soil. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, marched his army past the mounds that had once been Nineveh, without recognizing what they were. Greek culture spread across the Near East. New cities rose. Seleucia on the Tigris became a major center, not far from ancient Babylon. But the old Assyrian heartland, the cities along the northern Tigris, remained largely abandoned. The tells grew higher as wind and rain, and the slow processes of decay deposited layer upon layer of soil over the ruins. The Romans came, establishing a frontier along the Euphrates, occasionally campaigning eastward. They built a city at Mosul, across the Tigris from the great mound that local people called Kuyunjik, not knowing it was ancient Nineveh. The Romans heard stories about ancient empires that had ruled this region, but the stories were vague, confused, mixing different periods and peoples. Written records existed in Greek and Latin, mentioning Assyria, but these were derived from biblical accounts or from Persian sources, not from direct knowledge of Assyrian civilization itself. Christianity spread through the region. The Assyrian name survived, but now it designated Christian communities in northern Mesopotamia, people who spoke Aramaic and maintained ancient traditions, but who were culturally distinct from the Neo-Assyrian Empire that had fallen over 1,000 years earlier. These communities knew they inhabited land where great cities had once stood. They told stories about the ruins, attributing them to legendary kings, to Nimrod or Semiramis, to giants or demons. The actual history was lost, replaced by folklore. Islam arrived in the 7th century AD, transforming the religious landscape. Arab conquests brought new rulers, new languages, new cities. Baghdad rose as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, becoming one of the great cities of the medieval world. But the old cities of Assyria remained buried. The tells were landmarks, notable for their size, occasionally quarried for stone or brick, but their origins were forgotten. Travellers who passed the mounds sometimes wondered what they were, but no one knew. The medieval period brought occasional notice. A few Arab geographers mentioned the large mounds near Mosul, speculated that they might be ruins of ancient cities. Biblical references to Nineveh were known to Christian and Muslim scholars alike, but the connection between the biblical city and the actual mounds was uncertain. Some thought Nineveh was near Mosul, others placed it elsewhere. The tells kept their secrets. European travellers in the 16th and 17th centuries sometimes visited the region, describing the mounds in letters and travel accounts. A few made sketches, noting the size and regular shape of the tells, the occasional fragments of brick or stone visible on their surfaces. But archaeological excavation, as a systematic discipline, did not yet exist. The travelers looked at the mounds, wondered briefly what they might contain, then moved on to other destinations. The tells endured. Winter rains eroded their surfaces. Summer sun baked them hard. Shepherds grazed their flocks on the slopes. Farmers ploughed fields at the bases of the mounds. Occasionally, a plough would strike something hard, a stone relief or brick pavement, and the farmer would change direction, leaving the obstacle buried. No one understood what lay beneath. The layers of soil were too deep, the forgetting too complete. By 1800 AD, over 2,600 years had passed since Nineveh fell, the empire that had dominated the ancient world for 3 centuries, that had built magnificent cities and accumulated vast knowledge, that had created art and administration that influenced all subsequent empires, that had seemed eternal to those who lived under its power, was utterly forgotten, except as a name in ancient texts whose historical accuracy was doubted by scholars. The stones slept on, waiting for someone to remember, someone to dig, someone to bring their story back into light. The stones speak again. The rediscovery began with a French diplomat. Paul-Émile Botta was posted to Mosul as French consul in 1842. He had interests beyond diplomacy, a fascination with ancient history, and a willingness to fund excavations from his own pocket. He heard local stories about the mounds near Mosul, about how farmers sometimes found carved stones or bricks with strange markings. Botta decided to investigate. He started excavations at Kuyunjik, the large tell across the Tigris from Mosul that was actually ancient Nineveh. Though no one yet knew this, the initial digging was disappointing. Debris and rubble, but nothing particularly impressive. After months of frustration, Botta heard about another mound, about 16 kilometers to the north, where carved stones had reportedly been found. He moved his excavation there to a tell called Khorsabad. What Botta's workmen uncovered astonished him. Walls lined with carved stone relief, enormous winged bulls with human heads, cuneiform inscriptions covering surfaces. He had found Dur-Sharukin, Sargon II's capital, though he did not immediately know which ancient city it was. The reliefs showed battle scenes, tribute processions, building projects, all carved with skill and preserved under centuries of debris. Botta sent drawings and descriptions to Paris. The response was enthusiastic. This was evidence of a civilization virtually unknown from physical remains. An Englishman heard about Botta's discoveries and became determined to make his own. Austin Henry Layard was young, energetic, ambitious, convinced that even greater discoveries awaited if someone had the will to pursue them. He obtained limited funding and permission to excavate at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, south of Mosul. In 1845, Layard's workmen began digging. The results exceeded even Layard's hopes. Within days, they uncovered palace walls. Then came relief panels, superbly carved, showing scenes of warfare and hunting with artistic power that rivaled anything from classical Greece or Rome. Colossal winged bulls emerged from the earth, their faces still bearing traces of ancient paint. Layard realized he had found something extraordinary, the remains of a civilization that could rival Egypt in grandeur and antiquity. The excavation continued for months. Room after room of Ashurnasirpal's palace was cleared. The reliefs told stories in stone, readable even without understanding the cuneiform inscriptions that accompanied them. Kings besieged cities. Armies marched in formation. Tribute bearers presented exotic animals and precious goods. The level of detail was remarkable. Individual faces were distinct. Clothing and equipment were rendered precisely. These were historical documents, as much as artworks, records of actual campaigns and achievements. Layard's workmen also found tablets, clay objects covered with cuneiform writing. At this point, cuneiform had not been fully deciphered. Scholars in Europe were working on the script, comparing inscriptions from different sites, slowly building up understanding of the ancient Mesopotamian languages. The tablets from Nimrud, when eventually read, would provide names and dates, connecting the carved reliefs to specific historical periods and events. Layard returned to Kuyunjik, the mound Botta had abandoned, convinced it must contain something significant given its size. He was right. In 1849, he uncovered Sennacherib's palace, the palace without rival. More relief panels emerged, including the famous Lachish sequence showing the siege of a Judean city in meticulous detail. The palace was enormous, room after room extending deeper into the mound. Layard could not excavate it completely. The task was too large, but what he uncovered was enough to establish Nineveh's significance. Then came the greatest discovery. In 1850, while excavating in another part of the Koyunjik mound, Layard's workers broke through into rooms of Ashurbanipal's palace, and there, in several chambers, they found tablets. Not dozens, but thousands. The tablets were not arranged neatly. They had fallen when the palace collapsed and been buried under debris, but they had survived. Baked hard by the fires that destroyed Nineveh, the excavators did not immediately understand what they had found. Clay tablets were common in Mesopotamian sites, but as more and more were uncovered, as the count climbed into the thousands and then tens of thousands, realization grew. This was a library, the largest collection of cuneiform texts ever discovered. When the tablets were eventually shipped to London, and scholars began the long work of translating them, the true significance became clear. Here was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the foundational work of Mesopotamian literature, preserved in multiple copies. Here were omens and medical texts, astronomical observations and historical records, royal annals and scholarly commentaries. The intellectual life of ancient Assyria lay buried in these rooms, waiting to speak. The decipherment of cuneiform accelerated. Multiple scholars in different countries worked on the script, comparing inscriptions, building up vocabularies, establishing grammatical rules. By the middle 1850s, Akkadian cuneiform could be read with reasonable confidence. The tablets from Nineveh became readable documents, voices from the ancient world speaking in their own words about their civilization. The finds at Khorsabad, Nimrud, and Nineveh sparked an archaeological revolution. Other expeditions followed. Ashur, the ancient religious capital, was excavated by German teams in the early 1900s. Kalhu received more thorough excavation in the 20th century. Each site yielded more tablets, more reliefs, more artifacts. The picture of Assyrian civilization grew increasingly detailed and complex. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and other cities acquired collections of Assyrian artifacts. The colossal lamassu were shipped at enormous cost and effort, transported from excavation sites to rivers, floated downstream, loaded onto ships, carried across seas to stand in museum galleries. The stone guardians that had once protected palace entrances now stood in modern buildings, watched over by a different kind of visitor than they had been carved to impress. The Assyrians re-entered human consciousness, not as legend but as history. The biblical accounts of Assyrian conquests, once thought to be mythological or exaggerated, were confirmed by the Assyrians' own records. The names of kings mentioned in the Bible appeared on stone inscriptions and clay tablets. The cities described in ancient texts could be located, excavated, their plans mapped, and their artifacts recovered. A civilization that had been forgotten for over 2 millennia was remembered, studied, understood. The process of recovery continues. Modern excavations using more sophisticated techniques continue to reveal new information. Conservation efforts work to preserve artifacts and sites. Scholars continue to translate tablets, many of which still sit untranslated in museum collections. Digital archives make inscriptions and artifacts accessible to researchers worldwide. The stones continue to speak, their stories emerging slowly but persistently from beneath the earth and from within the archives. A living heritage. The name Assyrian survived through the centuries in a form its ancient bearers would not have expected. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire fell, the Assyrian people did not vanish. Many continued to live in the northern Mesopotamian homeland, adapting to new rulers, new empires that rose and fell over the centuries. They spoke Aramaic, the language that had become common throughout the ancient Near East, rather than the Akkadian of their ancient ancestors. But they maintained a distinct identity, rooted in their geographic homeland and their historical consciousness. With the spread of Christianity in the early centuries AD, many of these communities converted, becoming one of the oldest Christian populations in the world. They formed distinct churches: the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church. These communities preserved Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, as their liturgical language. They maintained ancient traditions of scholarship, copying manuscripts, preserving texts. In monasteries scattered across northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran, monks continued work that paralleled, in some ways, the scribal traditions of ancient Assyria. The connection to the ancient empire was complex. Modern Assyrian Christians are not direct descendants in a simple linear way. The population of the region mixed and changed over millennia, but there is geographic continuity, living in the same regions where ancient Assyria flourished. There is linguistic continuity, speaking languages descended from the Aramaic that became common in the late Assyrian period. And there is cultural continuity, a sense of belonging to a distinct people with ancient roots. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeological discoveries brought ancient Assyria back into historical consciousness, the connection became more explicit. Assyrian Christians began to identify more strongly with their ancient namesakes, seeing themselves as inheritors of a great civilization. This was partly reaction to the political situations they found themselves in. Minority populations in regions dominated by Arab or Kurdish Muslims, seeking historical legitimacy and recognition. The 20th century brought tragedy to these communities. During World War I, Assyrian Christians suffered massacres in the Ottoman Empire, part of the broader violence that also targeted Armenians and other minorities. Hundreds of thousands died or were displaced. Communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed. Survivors scattered, many fleeing to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or emigrating to Europe and the Americas. Through the turmoil, cultural identity persisted. Assyrian communities in diaspora maintained their languages, their churches, their sense of being a distinct people. They established schools teaching Syriac. They published newspapers and books. They formed organizations to preserve and promote Assyrian culture. The connection to ancient Assyria became part of this identity preservation, a source of pride and historical depth. In Iraq after World War I, under British mandate and then independent government, Assyrians served in military units and administrative positions. Relations with the majority Arab and Kurdish populations were often tense. Violence erupted periodically. The Simele massacre of 1933 saw Iraqi army units and Kurdish irregulars attack Assyrian villages, killing thousands. It was a grim reminder that being a minority population in the region carried risks. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new challenges. The Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf Wars, the period of sanctions, and especially the chaos following the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, created extremely difficult conditions. Assyrian communities faced targeted violence from extremist groups. Churches were bombed. Individuals were kidnapped or murdered for being Christian. Many fled, continuing the diaspora that had begun a century earlier. The rise of ISIS in 2014 brought the gravest crisis. ISIS occupied Mosul and the Nineveh plains where many Assyrian communities lived. Ancient churches were destroyed. The Assyrian population that remained was forced to flee or faced forced conversion or death. Communities that had existed for nearly 2,000 years were emptied within days. Some sites, including Mar Behna Monastery near ancient Nimrud, were damaged or destroyed by ISIS fighters. The same extremists who targeted living Assyrian communities also destroyed ancient archaeological sites. Nimrud's remains were bulldozed. Sculptures in the Mosul Museum were smashed with sledgehammers, the destruction filmed and broadcast as propaganda. The destruction was deliberate, targeting both the ancient past and the communities who saw themselves as its inheritors. It was an attempt to erase history, to destroy evidence of pre-Islamic civilizations and the diversity they represented. Since ISIS's defeat, some Assyrians have begun returning to their traditional homelands, but the communities are shadows of what they were. Many who fled will not return, having settled in Kurdish-controlled regions, in Baghdad, or abroad. The churches are being rebuilt, but the people are fewer. The continuity of presence, maintained through so many centuries and empires, has been severely disrupted. In diaspora, Assyrian communities work to preserve identity and culture. In Chicago, Detroit, Sydney, Stockholm, Assyrian neighborhoods maintain churches and community centers. Children learn Syriac alongside English or Swedish. Traditional music and dance are taught and performed. Organizations advocate for recognition of Assyrian rights and for protection of communities remaining in the homeland. The relationship to ancient Assyria remains part of this identity. Assyrian community centers display replicas of Lamassu. Cultural events celebrate both ancient heritage and Christian tradition. The rediscovery of ancient Assyria in the 19th century, the museums displaying Assyrian artifacts, the scholarly work on cuneiform texts. All of this provides modern Assyrians with historical depth and international recognition, even as their contemporary situation remains precarious. The living heritage is thus complex, mixing ancient roots and modern challenges, archaeological rediscovery and contemporary persecution, pride in historical civilization, and struggle for survival. The people who carry the name Assyrian today are not simply ancient Assyrians transported to the present. They are communities shaped by 2,000 years of history since the empire fell, by Christianity and Aramaic culture, by survival through many changes of regime and religion in their homeland. But the connection to the ancient past, however complicated and contested, remains part of who they understand themselves to be. Ambient interlude, the tell at twilight. The sun sinks toward the western horizon, painting the sky in layers of gold and rose and deepening blue. The tell rises from the plain, a hill too regular to be natural, its slopes smoothed by millennia of wind and rain. Grass grows on it now, green in spring, golden in summer. Small shrubs cling to its sides. At its summit, stones protrude from the soil, hints of walls that once stood tall. The light changes as the sun drops lower. Shadows stretch across the plain, reaching toward the east. The tell's western face glows in the last direct sunlight, while its eastern slope falls into shade. The transition is gradual, beautiful, the same sunset light that has fallen here for thousands of years, that illuminated the city when it stood, that witnessed its destruction, that has marked the passage of every day since. A bird circles overhead, riding the thermal currents, calling once, then gliding in silence. The sound echoes briefly, then fades. The plain is quiet. A distant village shows lights beginning to kindle as families prepare evening meals. The smoke of cooking fires drifts up, thin and pale against the darkening sky. Beneath the tell, beneath the grass and accumulated soil, the ancient city waits. Palaces with their carved reliefs buried in rubble. Streets paved with brick, now covered by meters of earth. Houses where families once lived, raised children, ate meals, slept and woke. All of it is hidden, preserved by burial, held in the earth like memories in a mind at rest. The stones do not know they are forgotten. They simply are, bearing the marks of ancient chisels, inscriptions proclaiming kings and victories, images of gods and beasts. They exist in darkness, patient as only stone can be patient, neither hoping nor despairing, simply enduring. The light fades further. Stars emerge in the deepening sky, the same stars that ancient astronomers tracked and recorded, mapping the heavens, calculating cycles, reading omens in celestial movements. The constellations wheel overhead, as they have always wheeled, indifferent to the affairs of empires and civilizations, to the rise and fall of cities, to the dreams and fears of those who watch them. Night settles over the tell. The plain grows dark and still. Somewhere, a night bird calls. The air cools. The grass moves slightly in the evening breeze, a soft whisper against the slope. The tell stands in darkness, a monument to time itself, a marker where past and present meet and merge. Tomorrow the sun will rise again. The light will return. The cycle continues, day following night following day, as it has since long before the first brick was laid here, as it will continue long after the last stone has crumbled to dust. The tell waits, patient and permanent in its own way, holding its secrets, offering them to any who care to dig. to listen, to remember. The twilight deepens toward full night. The world grows quiet. The ancient and the modern rest together under the same sky, under the same stars, in the same eternal present that contains all past and all future, where nothing is lost and everything endures. Reflections in deep time. 3,000 years is a long time in human terms. It is over 100 generations, more than any family can trace with certainty. It spans the invention of alphabetic writing and the development of computers, the domestication of the horse and the landing on the moon, the building of the first cities and the creation of nuclear weapons. From where we stand today, 3,000 years reaches back to a world almost unrecognizable. Yet it is the blink of an eye in geological time, barely a moment in the span of human evolution. The Assyrian Empire rose, flourished, and fell within 3 of those 3,000 years. From about 900 to 600 BC, it was the dominant power in the Near East, the center around which other states and peoples organized their politics and trade. Then it vanished, destroyed so thoroughly that within a few generations, its very existence became legendary, its cities buried, its written records unreadable. For over 2 millennia, the empire was forgotten, existing only as a name in ancient texts, whose accuracy was doubted. What does this say about permanence? The Assyrians built in stone, the most enduring material they had. They carved their achievements in rock faces and on stone tablets, creating monuments designed to last forever. They wrote on clay, thousands of tablets, recording everything from military campaigns to astronomical observations to receipts for commercial transactions. They believed, as most empires have believed, that their power was eternal, that they were building something that would endure. And in a sense, they were right. The stones did endure. The clay tablets survived, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces that housed them. When archaeologists excavated Nineveh and Kalhu, the reliefs and lamassu were found essentially intact under centuries of debris. The library tablets, though jumbled and damaged, were recovered by the tens of thousands. The physical remains of Assyrian civilization persisted through time that saw empires rise and fall, religions spread and transform, languages appear and vanish. But the meaning did not persist. The stones endured, but the civilization they represented was forgotten. The tablets survived but could not be read. For over 2,000 years, the monuments of Assyria stood or lay buried, physically present but culturally absent, their messages unheard, their stories untold. Physical survival without cultural memory is a kind of death, a silencing more profound than simple destruction. What brought Assyria back was not the endurance of stones but the curiosity of later ages. 19th century archaeologists, driven by a mix of scholarly interest, imperial competition, and biblical fascination, decided to dig in the mounds of Mesopotamia. What they found astonished them. A civilization of sophistication and power, documented in its own words and images, emerged from the earth. Scholars learned to read cuneiform. Museums displayed Assyrian artifacts. Books were written reconstructing Assyrian history. The culture that had been forgotten was remembered. This suggests something important about what actually endures. It is not merely physical objects, though those help. It is knowledge, maintained and transmitted through generations. The Assyrians are remembered now because we can read their tablets, because we have translated their inscriptions, because scholars have spent lifetimes studying their language and reconstructing their history. Without that intellectual work, the stones would remain mute, impressive perhaps, but meaningless, ruins whose origins were unknown and unknowable. This puts responsibility on the living. Civilizations endure not automatically, but through the work of those who choose to remember them, to study them, to pass knowledge forward. Libraries and museums, schools and universities, scholars and teachers, all serve this function. They are the mechanisms by which cultural memory persists, by which the achievements and failures of the past remain available to inform the present. What should we remember about Assyria? The military conquests and imperial administration, certainly. The artistic achievements, the libraries and scholarship, the sophisticated bureaucracy that managed a multi-ethnic empire, but also the cost the violence employed to build and maintain power, the deportations and destructions, the terror deliberately cultivated as a tool of statecraft. Assyria offers lessons both inspiring and cautionary, examples of human capability for organization and creation, alongside human capacity for cruelty and domination. The empire's fall offers its own lessons. Size and military power do not guarantee stability. Extractive systems that take, without creating sustainable prosperity, contain seeds of their own destruction. Diversity can be strength, but requires more than force to manage successfully. Empires rise, empires fall, and the patterns repeat across history because humans do not learn easily from others' experiences. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about time itself. What seems eternal is temporary. What appears permanent will pass. The Assyrian kings who carved boasts of eternal dominance into stone were wrong about the permanence but right about the stone. The stones outlasted the dominance, outlasted the civilization, outlasted the memory. They waited in silence until someone cared enough to uncover and read them. That caring, that choice to remember and study, is what brings the past into the present. We stand at our own moment in deep time. The things we build, the knowledge we create, the art we make, all of it will eventually become the past for future generations. Some of it will survive physically. Whether it survives culturally, whether future ages will remember and understand us, depends partly on what we preserve and how we preserve it, but also on choices those future people will make about whether our past matters to them. The Assyrian Empire fell over 26 centuries ago. Its cities are ruins, its language dead, its people scattered or vanished into the general population. But we can still read their tablets, still study their art, still learn from their achievements and mistakes. They speak to us across deep time because we choose to listen. That choice to remember, to study, to preserve and transmit knowledge about the past is perhaps the most distinctly human thing we do, the way we create continuity across generations, the way we transcend our individual mortality by participating in the longer story of our species. The tells rise from the Mesopotamian plain, marking where cities stood. The tablets rest in museums, waiting to be translated. The reliefs display frozen moments from 3,000 years ago. The stones endure, patient and silent, ready to speak when anyone cares to hear them. The empires pass, but the stones remain. And so long as we remember to look, to dig, to translate, to study, the past remains present, and the long conversation of humanity with itself continues.